that Ukraine is not a NATO member. Yes, we've shored up our NATO flanks, but that still leaves Ukraine exposed. Would the Secretary of State agree that Ukrainian security is European security, and by committing a greater support to Ukraine, we are trying to prevent a war rather than start one? And with the threat and invasion imminent, could I also call for the Secretary of State to provide more military support to Ukraine?
I fully agree with my right honourable friend that, look, Ukraine is part of Europe. Ukrainians consider themselves European, and it is absolutely the case that the ripples of anything that happens in Ukraine will be felt right across Europe, whether they are in NATO or not. NATO as itself isn't preventing individual countries through bilateral arrangements strengthen Ukrainian security and capability. The United Kingdom has done it, and Sweden's done it, not part of NATO, but nevertheless stood up for their values and stood side by side.
Shadow Secretary of State John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I extend a warm Labour welcome to the Speaker of the House of Representatives and her team this afternoon. The government has Labour's full support in assisting Ukraine, in confronting Russian aggression and in pursuing diplomacy even at this 11th hour. And we also support fully moves to reinforce the security of NATO allies, as the Labour leader and I told the Secretary-General at NATO HQ earlier this month. Can I ask the Secretary of State, the doubling of UK troops in Estonia is welcome, but it looks like an overlap in rotation, not a reinforcement. For how long will this double deployment last? And beyond the steps already announced, what more is he willing to do to reinforce allies on NATO's eastern flank?
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. And Mr. Speaker, can I just make a quick apology? There is a statement on Ukraine after this, and I apologise to the House that the statement has not yet arrived with my colleagues, or indeed with myself, even though I did write it. So, I don't know. Bureaucracy in action. So I do apologise to colleagues. First and foremost, that, as he says, overlap on relief and place can actually be there as long as we like. We can keep it that way, we can reconfigure, and indeed one of the purposes of forward basing our armoured vehicles in Sennelager in Germany allows us to have that flexibility where the vehicles are forward but the people can be interchanged. We will keep it under constant review. In addition, we've sent up to 350 personnel into Poland to jointly exercise and show bilateral strength. 100 extra Royal Engineers Squadron are there already in Poland, helping with the border fragility, I think, that the Belarusian migration caused. And in addition, we have exercise Cold Response at the end of March, which is a 30,000 plus exercise.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whether or not President Putin gives the go-ahead to military invasion, this unprecedented military intimidation is part of a long pattern of aggression against Western nations, including attacks on British soil and against British institutions. Does Ukraine not expose the flaws in the government's integrated review last year, with its focus on the Indo-Pacific and its plan to cut the British Army by another 10,000 soldiers? So, in light of the threats, will he halt any further army cuts? And will he restore the highest defence priority to Europe, the North Atlantic and the Arctic?
Contrary to the right honourable member's observation of the integrated review, I think it actually proves the integrated review correct, which is, first of all, alliances are the most important way that we can defend ourselves, whether that's through NATO, bilateral, trilateral, whether that's in the Pacific or Europe, and reinvesting in NATO, where we are now the second biggest spender in NATO. So, yes, troop numbers are scheduled to reduce, but spending on defence is going up to a record amount. An extra $24 billion over the comprehensive spending review is not money to be sniffed at. It's also a demonstration that with further defence engagement and investing in the sub-threshold capabilities, cyber, the National Cyber Force, and other areas, we can improve the resilience of countries that get vulnerable to Russian sub-threshold actions.
We come to the Chair of the Security Committee, Dr. Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What lessons have our government drawn from the consequences for Ukraine of its decision in 1994 unilaterally to give up all the nuclear weapons it had inherited from the Soviet Union in return for assurances on a piece of paper?
Well, I think it shows that what we have to do is make sure that the Budapest Memorandum, which was the signature between Russia and Ukraine in 1994, is stuck to, that Russia should honour all the treaties that it has signed in its statements to make sure that mutual recognition of each other's security is upheld. If they don't do that, then I think, as he rightly says, it opens up all sorts of questions about how much of Russia's word can we trust. And if we can't trust their word, then I'm afraid it's a very dangerous place to be in Europe.
We now come to SNP spokesperson Stuart Malcolm-Mack.
I'm grateful, Mr Speaker. Can I too, on behalf of the Scottish National Party, welcome Speaker Pelosi and the American delegation to the Chamber, and yes, put on record our congratulations to Team GB, in particular that fantastic curling team that so many of us have been enjoying over the recent days. As the Secretary knows, we have supported the government's actions in supporting Ukraine to defend itself against its neighbouring aggressor. Indeed, the actions the government have taken in terms of the military support it has given, those actions are in themselves an act against war. But during my visit to the capital a couple of weeks ago, there were some concerns at government and parliamentary level that they are still missing in some support that they would like, that I understand they have been discussing with his department. Could you give us an assurance or an update of some kind that those discussions are still ongoing?
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman and his comments about the Winter Olympics, Mr Speaker. In my constituency, I have one of two English curling rinks in my constituency at Barton Grange, and I look forward to a Scots Abroad event that can go on. Look, I think we are open to all sorts of suggestions. I speak regularly to my defence counterpart in Ukraine. It's incredibly important that, should we get through this with a diplomatic solution, that we continue to help support Ukraine's resilience, both in capacity building, training, and also nation building, so we make sure it's a strong and secure state.
Malcolm.
I'm grateful for that, Mr Speaker. I may be jumping the gun slightly because I suspect he might come to this in his statement after questions. But one of the things that we were asked about a lot there is the new grouping between Ukraine, Poland and the United Kingdom. But the detail on that isn't quite out there just yet. Could he update the House exactly on what this new grouping hopes to achieve? And can he give an assurance that it will complement the work of other allies rather than overlapping them?
Yes, we're working through those details right now, and as soon as I can, I will update him and the House on that. It's incredibly important that we recognise that Ukraine borders a number of major NATO countries who will feel the direct consequence of an invasion. It's also important that President Putin's view of many of those countries, which he himself has written down in previous essays, is something that could continue should he be successful in Ukraine. And therefore, it's really important the UK plays a strong role in reassurance of not only NATO countries, but other friends like Sweden and Finland.
James Grundy.
Question number 3, please, Mr Speaker.
Mr Speaker, defence primacy in the English Channel under Operation Isotrope will seek to prevent the arrival of small boats on their own terms in the UK, whilst ensuring the safety of life at sea. We are working closely with the Home Office and others to deliver this outcome.
James Grundy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Would my honourable friend express his thanks to those brave armed forces personnel currently supporting the UK Border Force in the important work they are doing in the Channel?
I would, Mr Speaker, and it's an opportunity perhaps to remark on the fact that both at home, whether it be supporting the work of Border Force in the Channel or still defence personnel involved in the response to the pandemic, and overseas, as we're seeing in the news every day at the moment, our nation's armed forces are available at all times, at home and overseas, to do whatever is required to keep this country safe and secure.
Cavan Jones.
The Minister last week on radio said in order to undertake Operation Isotope that the Ministry of Defence will have to acquire new boats, for example. Can you give an assurance to the House that they will be procured in the UK and not follow the example of the Home Office, who have to date purchased such equipment from Holland?
Well, Mr Speaker, the honourable gentleman refers to an interview in which I mentioned that they may be leased rather than procured. And as I also went on to explain in that interview, there are a number of different platform types that will have different degrees of relevance and utility in the Channel, all of which is under consideration to make sure that the right balance of platforms is available for what will be a very tricky task.
Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Wouldn't that all be unnecessary if the French just controlled their own border and that our forces could then be redeployed, not protecting things in the Channel? Isn't the French at fault?
Well, Mr. Speaker, in the interests of bonhomie, I'll refrain from using such forthright language, but the honourable gentleman certainly has a point.
Shadow Minister Stephanie Peake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the last 2 years, the number of migrants making dangerous channel crossings has tripled, with the Home Secretary failing to tackle people smugglers. Now the Navy have been called in. Can the Minister clearly outline the Navy's role and explain why the Ministry of Defence is being sidelined in our discussions with our French counterparts?
Mr. Speaker, the role of the Royal Navy, as we said in the UQ a few weeks ago, is principally around control and coordination of a wide range of government assets that at the moment are not brought to bear, we would argue, in the most coherent way towards the task at hand. The Royal Navy are looking at this, augmenting it with some Royal Navy platforms, both in terms of ships and surveillance and reconnaissance platforms. But it's important to note that most Royal Navy platforms, Mr. Speaker, don't have the outboard height required to be able to meaningfully be part of any interdiction operations in the Channel. So principally it's command and control coordination exercise, and if there's extra assets we can bring, we will.
Kenny McCaskill. Not here. Graham Morris.
Sir.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I should like to answer questions 6 and 17 together. We recognise the need to manage risk and ensure resilience in our manufacturing and supply chains, including rotary wing. Through past and current investment in rotary wing capabilities, including Wildcat and Apache, and upgrades to Merlin and Chinook, the UK industrial base remains well placed to support existing and future helicopter platforms and continues to be a market of great interest to our industrial partners.
Red Morris.
Can I thank the Minister for that response? I'd also like to declare an interest, Mr. Speaker, as Chair of the United Group of Labour MPs in Parliament. And further to my previous defence question on the 15th of November, when I asked the Minister what steps his department were taking to ensure the resilience of helicopter supply chain in the UK, can the Minister now give assurances to this House that whoever wins the contract for the new Puma replacement helicopters, these will be both manufactured and assembled here in the United Kingdom?
I thank the Honourable for his question. As we said previously, as my right honourable friend has said, the competition will be launched very shortly in relation to the new medium helicopter to which the Honourable Gentleman, I believe, is referring. I'm confident, given the skills and capabilities in this country and the nature of that competition, that a very substantial amount of benefit will flow to the UK as a result of that procurement.
Christian Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I also declare an interest, and I echo the words of my honourable friend from Easington. We don't want to get into another situation like we did with the Fleet Solid Support ships. Will the government ensure that the value to the UK of placing these contracts with UK suppliers and UK manufacturers is included and priced into the deal and the contract?
The Honourable Gentleman makes a fair point. It is absolutely critical that we ensure that the social value associated with this contract is fully and fairly reflected through that tender process. He has my assurance that we will be doing that. As I say, it won't be long before he'll be able to see more on that subject.
James Gray.
Speaker, I entirely agree with others who have spoken about the importance of having British manufacturers producing these things. However, we have a very, very strong relationship with the United States of America, and I welcome the fact that we've ordered 50 new Apache attack helicopters and that we're upgrading our Chinooks as well. Would the Minister not agree with me, however, that Boeing UK are now, I think, one of the 4th or 5th largest suppliers to the MOD, and that Boeing UK, as a British manufacturer, are hopeful soon of exporting goods of the new airplanes to America?
They are indeed. They're a strategic partner of ours. My honourable friend is absolutely right. And they also invest heavily. I would pay tribute to the work they do in terms of enhancing their apprenticeships, the academic work done, including in the far north of Scotland from our base at Lossy. They are an important strategic partner who do bring value to the UK.
Shadow Minister Chris Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to do something quite surprising, Mr. Speaker, and I'm going to agree with the Secretary of State when he says of this helicopter competition, he does not want a here today, gone tomorrow supplier. So what are the Minister's plans to ensure long-term investment in the UK helicopter industry, particularly in high-value engineering design and manufacturing jobs, apprenticeships, and ensure enduring skills development in this vital industry?
The With the NMH, which again I'm sure is what my the Honourable Gentleman was referring to, it's likely, given the timescale, we want to have this in service in 2025, as close to that as possible, that it'll be an existing platform that we are seeking to procure. But that absolutely doesn't gainsay the fact that we'll want to see real social value created. So in terms of engineering skills and in terms of capabilities in this country. But that will be part of the competition.
Neil Hamley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I give my apologies for my honourable friend from East Lothian who's been turfed off a train on his way to the House. Number 7, please. Thanks.
I'm very grateful. I'm delighted that we are en route to the complete remediation of Dalgety Bay. Environmental sensitivities inevitably have a significant impact on the length of time it's taking to complete this project. MOD and SEPA officials last met formally on the 24th of November. SEPA also have representatives on the site continually to monitor the work that is being undertaken.
Neil Hamley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Minister for that answer. The people of Dalgety Bay, my Kirkcaldy and County Meath constituency, have had to put up with radioactive waste on the shore since the Second World War, and thanks to the dogged determination of my predecessor Roger Mullen and my own persistence, the work began last May. However, the Ministry promised us that they would keep us updated, both myself and the community, updated on progress, but we have had nothing from the Ministry of Defence since May of 2021, and I wonder if the Minister can answer why that is and if he will make sure that an update is forthcoming.
I can give an update to the Honourable Gentleman now. I think, as he is aware, we assumed it would take 2 seasons to do the complete remediation. I very much hoped that would have therefore been concluded by the autumn of this year. The Honourable Gentleman is aware of the issues with bird life that ensures that there's only a set period of time we can do it. We applied and got additional time, extended time during the summer last year to work. We will apply again to get extended time this year. I hope that will be sufficient, but I have to share with the Honourable Gentleman that it may not be until 2023 that this is concluded. I hope that's not the case, but it is possible. We're keeping it under review. I will write further to the Honourable Gentleman.
Ben Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question 9.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Defence puts diversity and inclusion at the heart of everything we do. We regard it as mission critical. We have an ambition of 30% inflow of women by 2030, and army recruitment for ethnic minorities is currently at 11.7%. Mr. Speaker, we know that we must build a diverse force to face the diverse threats that our nation faces.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Improving recruitment in areas like Wolverhampton would really help with diversity in the armed forces, and I also have a very high rate of unemployment in Wolverhampton. What more can his department do to ensure every young person in Wolverhampton is aware of the fantastic opportunities open to them in the armed forces?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I should put on record that Wolverhampton has a long and very proud tradition of people in the armed forces. And what we can do is point out that recruiting is undergoing constant improvement. And can I invite her to visit her Army Recruitment Centre in Queen Street in Wolverhampton to celebrate the amazing careers on offer to young people?
We have Shadow Minister Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Improving diversity and inclusion in the armed forces must also mean supporting disabled veterans. The Veterans Mobility Fund closed last year, passing the financial burden to charities like Help for Heroes to fund essential mobility equipment not available on the NHS. As forces charities face funding pressures, does the Minister feel that this decision is fair?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, we face constant pressures, but I should put on record, Mr. Speaker, that we've doubled the amount that normally goes into supporting our magnificent armed forces charities, and it's only right that we do work in partnership with these magnificent people.
Jameson.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. On the issue of inclusion, the Defence Secretary will be aware that several parliamentarians have been lobbying hard, but privately, to get visa fees abated or preferably culled completely as a function of service. Can I please ask him where we are with the consultation and on any announcements that may be forthcoming?
Mr. Speaker, and we acknowledge with gratitude his active role in that debate, and he should wait for news this week on that issue.
Myra Farrier.
Question number 10, Mr. Speaker.
Women are an integral part of our armed forces and have thriving careers. The Defence Committee's report into women in the armed forces made a number of important recommendations. And having tested the recommendations of Defence's own service women's networks, I adopted almost all of them, and in many cases actually took them further.
Women serving in the forces alongside their husband or partner have lost out on their military accommodation when they've reported incidents of domestic violence because the army has prioritised the needs of the male soldier. Women have also missed out on promotions or career opportunities as a result of reporting too. What steps is the Secretary of State taking to ensure that victims of domestic violence are not further victimised by armed forces processes where they are brave enough to make a report against a serving soldier?
I'm saddened to hear what she says. I'd be delighted to meet with the Honourable Lady to discuss it, and if she could bring along the examples that she refers to in detail, I'll be very happy to sort it. No one should be disadvantaged for making a service complaint or even indeed a criminal complaint, whether they are male or female, and we do not tolerate in any way domestic abuse or sexual abuse within the armed forces.
Richard Graham.
Can I pay tribute to the appointment and work of our Defence Attaché in Vietnam, Bea Wolcott, who may also be going to another Southeast Asian appointment before long, and ask the Defence Secretary if he agrees with me that actually there is huge potential for women in these roles, which combine diplomacy, procurement, as well as armed forces expertise.
Some of our best ambassadors are women, and I hope soon that some of our best or even more defence attachés are women. It's an extremely important part of defence engagement. The Defence Command Paper committed to investing in that network, not only with better infrastructure but also better training and support. She does a fantastic job. I'd like to see many more, and I think it's a great career opportunity as well.
Ellie Reeves.
Question number 11.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, refer the Honourable Lady to the exchange I gave in response to question 3.
Ellie Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government has spent over £200 million on deals with the French authorities, £780,000 on 2 Navy vessels that have not intercepted a single boat, and now they are insisting on pushback tactics, which the Navy have rightly said they won't use. The human cost is harrowing. In November, 27 people, including children, died when their boat sank. So instead of wasting more taxpayers' money on unworkable initiatives, will the Minister finally back the solutions that will fix this crisis, opening safe routes of passage, meaningful engagement with the French authorities and a proper plan to tackle people smuggling?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure that they're mutually exclusive. I mean, I absolutely agree with the things that the Honourable Lady gave as the solution at the end of her question, but I think that they have to sit alongside a very robust and resilient effort in the Channel to make sure that even when the things that the Honourable Lady advocates are in place, there is still the ability to protect our borders and stop people landing here, not on their own terms.
Duncan Beck.
Question number 13, please, Mr. Speaker.
Unlucky for some, Mr. Speaker. AUKUS is a generational commitment to the security of the Indo-Pacific. Last month I agreed with my Australian counterpart additional steps to deepen our bilateral cooperation in the region, building on the deployment of 2 UK offshore patrol vessels and facilitated by an enhanced defence staff in Canberra.
Duncan Baker.
Mr. Speaker, the AUKUS deal highlights the benefits of cooperation between the Royal Navy and the Royal Australian Navy. Their first boat in 1914, the HMAS AE1, was lost with all hands. This made the sacrifice of those who gave their lives, and almost 6,000 others in this service will be commemorated with a submariner memorial. Over £500,000 has been raised to fund this under the guidance of one of my constituents, who is the project director. Will the Secretary of State join me in thanking our submariners for all they do in the protection of our country, and will he attend the dedication if he can?
My honourable friend highlights a very important part of our armed forces. I want to pay tribute to submariners who keep us very safe 24 hours a day around these shores. It's been 50 years of the continuous at-sea deterrent, and before that they played a strong role in both defeating the Nazis and indeed making sure that we were protected. Few of us are privileged to know what they do often under those seas, and I want to join with him in remembering those early submariners who in 1914 and onwards made the ultimate sacrifice, often not only in service of their country but also in pushing the boundaries to get us to where we are today.
John Speller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's encouraging that the AUKUS agreement has bipartisan support in all 3 countries. But surely the Minister will accept it's got to be about more than submarines and just military themselves. So can he outline how we're going to cooperate to deal with the really pressing problem of supply chain resilience and security, which is an increasingly weak point for our military effectiveness and sustainability?
The right honourable gentleman is absolutely right. I mean, he is right to point out the fragility in the submarine supply chain, but not just for us, for the United States, for all of them. They are highly complex boats that are made, and keeping them maintained and also a skill base is a real challenge for us all, which is why we've invested in a record number of apprentices and indeed increased much of the funding around it. He's right in AUKUS. AUKUS has to be not only about capacity building and a capability, but also about how the United Kingdom and the United States industrial base can assist and support and develop those capabilities in Australia. It can't be done on its own, it has to be done with all of us.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Space. Oh, no, number 14. Thank you.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker. Over and above the £5 billion already committed to satellite communications, we are investing an additional £1.5 billion in space capabilities. The Defence Space Strategy sets out our focus on ISR, satellite communications, space domain awareness and space command and control. This clear strategic direction has been welcomed by industry and allies alike.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Space in all its guises presents an unparalleled opportunity to drive British science and technical innovation, create well-paid and rewarding jobs, boost our economy and, above all, defend ourselves. Can my right honourable friend expand further and tell the House what the MOD is doing to ensure that we deliver all of those opportunities?
My friend is correct in every respect. That additional £1.5 billion of investment implies very significant space R&D and the jobs and the skills and the expertise that goes with it. It includes investment in things like Astari, our ISR programme. It also includes innovation spend as part of the £1.5 billion package on programmes such as Minerva. By doing this investment, not only are we ensuring that we are meeting the threats of the future, but we are helping to build capability and expertise and skills and jobs that will serve defence and the wider civil space programme.
Question number 15, please.
The UK continues to actively support its allies on NATO's Eastern Front. The Prime Minister recently announced a further uplift of UK defence support to Eastern allies, including doubling the number of UK troops in Estonia, deploying more RAF aircraft to southern Europe, and deploying HMS Trent and a Type 45 destroyer to the Eastern Mediterranean.
Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recognise the efforts being made by the French President to ensure that we have a peace summit, and I do pray he is successful, because unity with our allies matters now more than ever. A point that I hope some members opposite take into account before making cheap populist swipes at our allies and neighbours. So what is the UK government doing to ensure that we have that united European and NATO strategy to demonstrate our commitment to Ukraine and our deep desire for a diplomatic solution?
All of us, including the French President, are absolutely signed up to the NATO alliance, all 30 of us, and indeed it was NATO that responded to Russia's draft treaty that they offered in December, and we responded in January. That is the common position we are all bound to, and in that position we will not reward aggression, we will not compromise on NATO's open door policy, and we will stick together as an alliance to defend the sovereign rights of countries and their right to choose, irrespective of what they do to that choice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're proud that the Armed Forces are one of Britain's biggest providers of apprenticeships. Since 2014, we've enrolled more than 96,000. There are around 21,000 apprentices at any one time. And I was honoured recently to meet apprentices from across all three services who are doing qualifications from level 2 all the way to degree courses.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I just thank the Secretary of State and his team for the dignity in which they've shown in the recent affairs with Ukraine and Russia. The Ministry of Defence is doing huge work with apprenticeships, which other departments should follow. Harlow has a remarkable cadet programme in the Navy, RAF and Armed Forces. Will the Ministry of Defence look at whether cadets who'd like to stay on in the Armed Forces can then progress into a military apprenticeship? And will he come and visit our remarkable cadet schemes in my constituency of Harlow?
Of course, all young people should be aware of the amazing opportunities both for apprenticeships and careers in the Armed Forces, and I would be really honoured to visit his constituency of Harlow to see that firsthand, because the bottom line, Mr. Speaker, is military service gives you skills for life.
Jamie Stone.
Mr. Speaker, several years ago, a young man came to see me. He was about to leave school and he was keen as mustard to join the Armed Forces. However, he had been diagnosed as being on the spectrum. And although I wrote to the then Defence Minister, he fell at the first hurdle and could not make the career he wished to. Could I ask the front bench, is this possibility of recruiting people who are on the spectrum being considered? Because it might be fantastically useful in terms of the cyber threat that we most clearly face.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. He's absolutely right. We are actively considering recruiting people with neural diversity because of their capacity for working in the cyber sphere. So I'm very pleased he raised it, and I can confirm we're actively looking at that.
Adam Holloway.
Breaking, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The new Army Reserve under Future Soldier will improve recruitment and retention across the whole reserve force. And the bottom line is, Mr. Speaker, that we're doing that by improving the offer and giving young officers and reserve soldiers the opportunity to train and deploy with regulars globally and nationally.
Adam Holloway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend accept that reserve officers join to have opportunities to deploy and train commanding informed units? Why does the future soldier narrative prioritise individual augmentation over deploying formed bodies for overseas roles short of all-out war?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree with my honourable friend that, of course, reserve officers seek to deploy informed units, and we're in agreement with that, and that's why that's in black and white in Future Soldier. But we shouldn't deny the opportunity for individuals, whether they be officers or enlisted people, to deploy on operations or training to gain valuable experience.
Andrew Higginbottom.
Question number 19. Sir.
Mr. Speaker, as I confirmed at NATO Defence Ministers' meeting last week, I will double the number of UK troops stationed in Estonia, will deploy the 2 Royal Navy ships to the Eastern Mediterranean, and the RAF fast jet deployment in Southern Europe will be increased to squadron strength. This comes on top of the deployment of 350 Royal Marines to Poland to support the Polish Armed Forces.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Secretary of State for that answer. The current forward deployed forces of the UK and NATO were put in place in 2017 at a time that Russia was acting belligerently. Circumstances have moved on significantly since then. Russia isn't just belligerent but openly hostile, supporting Belarus with the weaponisation of migrants, as well as building up the most significant military force since the Second World War. Could the Secretary of State therefore give some more detail on the planning going on in the Ministry of Defence and NATO should further reinforcements be needed by NATO, but also for any refugee crisis that might then follow?
The Supreme Allied Commander Europe requested a few weeks ago at a sort of donor conference for members of NATO alliance to put forward a range of forces. Some of those forces were the ones I have listed, and we are guided by where he wishes to deploy them to provide either resilience, reassurance or containment. NATO has a whole range of options that it can deploy at time of crisis, graduated response plans, etc. And they will no doubt play in should Russia do the foolish mistake of invading Ukraine.
Zellian Hart in topicals.
Topical 1, please, Mr. Speaker.
It's been withdrawn. I don't have an open statement. So there we are. Mr. Speaker, despite current global events, the Ministry of Defence remains firmly on course to deliver the biggest modernisation of our armed forces. Today we have published the 2021 Defence Equipment Plan report, which sets out our plans to deliver against the priorities we outlined in the integrated review last year. Backed by over £24 billion spending increase over this 4-year spending period, this equipment plan sets out how military capability will evolve to meet emerging threats. Defence procurement will be at the cutting edge. This implies risk, but through the Defence and Security Industrial Strategy and our ambitious acquisition reform programme, we are determined to deliver for defence and taxpayer.
Zellian Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Less than a couple of weeks ago, a boat ran aground close to Rye Harbour during low tide, and 21 migrants disembarked and disappeared on the run. It is reported that Border Force later turned up to the village to inform locals that 16 of them, without IDs, had been arrested. How can the MOD work together with Border Force and the Home Office to take control, defend and protect our borders from migrants entering the UK?
Order. The Honourable Lady knows that top is going to be short and punchy. You can't make full speeches to a topical question. Secretary of State.
My honourable friend highlights one of the big challenges in controlling the Channel. I can reassure it's exactly the situation we are trying to deal with. We must ensure we intercept each vessel so they cannot arrive in this country on their own terms. Under Operation Isotope, we are planning to take an enhanced role controlling cross-government assets to tackle such migration flows.
Shadow Secretary of State John.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mali military rulers have recently hired 1,000 Russian mercenaries, and 4 days ago France announced the withdrawal of all 2,400 of their troops who are based there to combat the growing threats from Islamist terrorist groups. What changes will the Defence Secretary now make to the 300 UK troops stationed in Mali?
The right honourable colleague is absolutely right to point out one of the challenges with the French as the framework nation effectively withdrawing from Mali and the woeful state of the Malian Wagner Group relationship, Malian government, which has put us in a very difficult position. The United Kingdom is obviously deployed in the UN mission, MINUSMA, alongside the Germans and the Swedes, and we are now reviewing, obviously, what next steps we take. We are, of course, committed to the United Nations efforts. The United Kingdom is there for the UN to be both a good UN citizen and to do what we can to help West Africa. However, he's right to point out the corrosive and destabilising influence of Wagner raises many questions. We shall keep that under review and return to the House with more details.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
We now know that the Cold War is back with a vengeance. In the closing stages of the Cold War, we regularly spent between 4.5% and 5% of GDP on defence. Has the time come to set a higher target than a bare 2%? Surely 3% should be a minimum.
Mr. Speaker, I think I win the bet for the predicted question from my right honourable friend. Look, I think it's absolutely clear, as I've always said, that our defence budget and our defence disposition should be based on the threat, and if the threat changes, we should be perfectly open to considering those changes, and we shall do, and I shall certainly pray him an aid if I make the case coming forward. We should also recognise that the alliance collectively well outspends Russia. All 30 nations put together spend hundreds of billions of pounds on defence, way above what Russia spends. That's the strength of alliance. That's why we need 30 members, and that's why we can make a difference to Russia.
Malcolm.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the cyber attack in Ukraine last week, how is the government strengthening cybersecurity at home in response to growing threats and Russian aggression?
The National Cyber Security Strategy that effectively started under the last Labour Prime Minister Gordon Brown and has developed over the years with significant funding, I think 19 billion in the first 2010 government that established the National Cyber Security Centre alongside GCHQ, has made real step changes in improving our cyber security. We are, of course, completely aware that Russia plays across the global cyber network, doesn't just focus on Ukraine. We've already experienced a number of cyber attacks over the last few years from Russia. We stand ready to defend against it and will continue to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the proud mum of a Royal Navy officer, I have an interest in defence matters. We in Cornwall are very proud of Spaceport Cornwall. Does my right honourable friend see it having a role as part of the defence space strategy?
As my honourable friend's son will be well aware, the daughter. I do apologise. I'm so pleased. I'm even more pleased that the honourable friend's daughter graces the Royal Navy. She will know the increasing importance of space to all the armed forces, and I can assure her that we are actively looking at ambitions to support the wider government ambition to have private companies launch from the UK this year.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to the question from the honourable member for Bracknell on the government's response to the immigration costs for armed forces personnel. It's good to hear that consultation response will be published, but can the Minister confirm that he's working to lower the proposed 12-year threshold so that the foreign and Commonwealth community can actually benefit?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, he doesn't have long to wait. He'll find out on Wednesday.
Andrew Lowe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent's father, as a former Afghan army officer in hiding, wasn't able to get an ARAP. Could I ask the Defence Minister to meet with me to discuss this further, please?
Mr. Speaker, very happy to meet with my honourable friend, but as he and colleagues around the House will appreciate, and I know it's a disappointment to many, ARAP was never a mechanism for rank-and-file members of the Afghan National Army to come to the UK, but I'm happy to discuss the particular case he mentions.
Andrew Gwynn.
The UK is now the only atomic nation with no official recognition or compensation to nuclear test veterans and their families. Ahead of the 70th anniversary of the first British nuclear test later this year, will ministers now do the right thing and give these veterans the recognition they deserve?
Look, I hear what the honourable gentleman says, and I absolutely recognise that we are now the only country to do so. The last internal review was in December. I've asked officials to go back and look at that again.
Richard Drax.
My right honourable friend said the amount we spend on defence depends on the threats that we face. Can I remind him that we can't just conjure up battalions, and can, like two honourable members from the other side of the House, please ask him to reverse this disastrous decision to reduce our army by 10,000?
My honourable friend has often campaigned on the size of the army. All I would say to him is, first and foremost, we have to recognise that modernisation is an important aspect of making sure our armed forces are fit to fight. There's simply no point having mass in a hollow armed forces. For too long, we had that out of step. We either had lots of people and inadequate equipment, or we had expensive equipment and not enough people. This Defence Command Paper put that in balance. That means it can deliver what it says on the tin, and it doesn't let those people down.
Gregory Campbell.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the tribute paid to our dear friend and colleague Christopher Stalford, whom we shall all miss terribly. On a lighter note, can I ask the Secretary of State if he would join with me at the Northern Ireland Air Show in my constituency, where all the armed services each year put on a magnificent display in trying to attract young people to a very rewarding career in the armed services?
I'd be delighted to come.
Sarah Atherton.
Mr. Speaker, with the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme, I spent some time with the Commando Littoral Response Force in the High Arctic during their preparations for the forthcoming exercise called Response, involving 35,000 troops from 28 nations. So would my right honourable friend agree with me? This is not only a show of NATO's strength and unity, but the Royal Marine Commandos have shown themselves a valuable commodity with skills in mountain, Arctic and amphibious warfare.
Mr. Speaker, firstly, very grateful to the Honourable Lady and all colleagues who are part of the AFPS. It's a fantastic thing. She's absolutely right that it is both a demonstration of the way the Royal Marines are transforming and our commitment to NATO, but also the integrated review coming to life, because the littoral response groups in the High North and in the Western Indian Ocean are two of the key new innovations of that paper.
Rachel Muscle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Ministry of Defence leases 37,500 homes from Annington Homes. 7,230 of these are vacant, while 12,000 Afghan refugees have been in bridging hotels for over 6 months. This just cannot be right. So what is the Ministry of State going to do about this?
We've made 550 SFA units available, and and all the questions on this should be directed to local authorities, but we're doing everything we can to ensure that Afghan families get settled in the way they deserve.
Dean Russell.
Mr. Speaker, last week I had the pleasure of visiting Watford's ex-servicemen club, and where I met the fantastic staff during an evening of darts. I met with Norman McGuigan while I was there, and he's the founder of the Official Minds at War charity, who works closely with Liz Burns, a local resident, and many great volunteers across the country to provide mental health support for veterans. Good jobs help deliver good mental health. So could the Minister please let me know what is being done to ensure service personnel can take up jobs within our thriving defence industry? Thank you.
We're fighting over the privilege of answering the question for the honourable gentleman. As my honourable friend said, 21,000 apprentices are inside the armed forces at any one time, and we're also committed to lifelong learning. I think for 5 years after they leave the services, they can apply and get support to retrain. It's a great opportunity for our service personnel who've got terrific skills.
Dave Dugan.
Does the Secretary of State agree with me that the same esteem, respect and cooperation that the UK enjoys with Australia will also be a feature of UK-Scottish relations on matters defence and security after independence? But crucially, unlike today, Scotland as an independent state will have a seat at the table and a decision-making process role.
Absolutely.
Speaker, this year the SNP are in favour of NATO membership. Who knows where they'll be at the end of it? Of course, if they want to be part of NATO, they'll have to spend 2% of GDP. Given they'll be almost bankrupt, I doubt they'll ever spend anything.
Dear Crosby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Support for the defence jobs is important, but so is support for our veterans. Mr. Speaker, does the Minister agree with me that the Armed Forces charity SAFA, who do a particularly excellent job on Anglesey, play a vital role in supporting our veterans?
Speaker, well, I do agree. SAFA do an absolutely magnificent job, and I've seen them firsthand in Aldershot. But I would also like to put on record my thanks, Mr. Speaker, for everything the Honourable Lady does for veterans in her constituency.
Mr. Speaker, the nuclear test veterans, as we've already heard, are a group of individuals who are they're elderly, and many of them have sadly already passed away. It is in the Secretary of State's power to award medals at this point. Will he do this?
I'm sorry to inform the Honourable Lady it's not in my power to afford medals.
Michael Fabricant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, the Royal Air Force took part in Operation, or exercise rather, Blue Flag in Israel. What lessons did the Royal Air Force learn from working with the Israeli Air Force?
I can't say right now, but what I could probably say, it's about readiness. Be ready, because you never know where the threat comes from.
Speaker, will the Secretary of State promise me he will listen to the Reith lectures, especially the bits about artificial intelligence and robotic warfare, and then think about our defence plans?
Yes.
James Ray.
Like my honourable friend, the member for Wrexham, I very much welcome the fact that the MOD are taking the Arctic and the threat from Russia along its 20,000-mile border in the Arctic very, very seriously indeed, as are NATO. But there's been a very long promised policy paper being produced by the MOD. When is it due to be printed? Published? Produced?
My honourable friend, look, it will be produced in March when I go and visit, hopefully, a cold response. When I came into office, I discovered it was one of those classic government strategies that had absolutely nothing in it other than a nice bit of narrative. I said, I'm not going to launch that until there's some solid offers and deliverables in it. I paused it, we rewrote it, and then it will be launched.
Final question, Stuart C. Macklin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Secretary of State what discussions he's had with allies about the number of people who might seek refugee protection in the event of a Russian invasion of the Ukraine, and how he is going to go about ensuring there's an appropriate and coordinated humanitarian response to that?
Mr. Speaker, this is very important and perhaps very likely consequence of what may happen in Ukraine. The honourable gentleman appreciate that that's not necessarily a response that the Ministry of Defence would lead on, but very obviously we stand by to support other government departments in doing so.
That ends questions. We now come to the statement. Can I call the Secretary of State for Defence, Ben Wallace?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I've said earlier, I apologise to honourable members opposite for the lateness in them having sight of the statement. Mr. Speaker, with permission, I would like to update the House on the latest situation regarding Russia's actions towards Ukraine. As at 900 hours today, there are now more than 110 battalion tactical groups massed around Ukraine's borders with Russia and Belarus. In addition, in the Black Sea Fleet, there are 2 amphibious groups, 9 cruise missile-equipped Russian ships, and a further 4 cruise missile-capable vessels in the Caspian Sea. In the last 48 hours, contrary to Kremlin assurances, we have seen a continued increase in troop numbers and a change in force disposition, moving from holding areas to potential launch locations. All the indicators point to increasing numbers and readiness of Russian forces, and, not surprising to many of us, the pledge to withdraw Russian troops from Belarus at the end of their joint military drills on the 20th of February was not carried out, and the exercise has now been extended until further notice. Complementing this troop build-up has been the proliferation of false flag operations, propaganda stunts, and Russian news outlets carrying fictitious allegations. These are not the actions of a Russian government fulfilling its repeated declarations that it has no intention of invading Ukraine. In fact, we have seen over the last few weeks the Russian playbook being implemented in a way that gives a strong cause for concern that President Putin is still committed to an invasion. I believe he is in danger of setting himself on a tragic course of events leading to a humanitarian crisis instability and widespread suffering, not just of Ukrainians, but also of the Russian people. Russians, like many of us, know the consequences of military interventions. The Soviet Union in Afghanistan, the First War in Chechnya. These are just two of the examples that Russia faced where too many young men returned home in zinc-lined coffins. And the government therefore urges President Putin, for the sake of his own people and even at this 11th hour, to rule out the invasion of Ukraine and recommit to a diplomatic process for us to address the perceptions of the Kremlin. Over recent weeks, my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, and I have engaged in numerous engagements with our international counterparts, including my own visit to Moscow to meet with Defence Minister Shoigu and General Valery Gerasimov. We have made clear our determination to uphold the defensive principles of NATO and to defend the right of sovereign countries to make choices about their own security arrangements. As the Russian government itself has signed up to, states, and I quote, have an equal right to security. We reaffirm the inherent right of each and every participating state to be free to choose or change its security arrangements, including treaties or alliances. That statement, Mr. Speaker, was signed by the Russians in 1975 in the Helsinki Final Act, in 1995 in the Budapest Summit Declaration, in 1999 in the Istanbul Summit, and most lately in 2010 at the Astana Summit. We urge Russia to stick to its commitments that it has openly made and signed up to over the years. My counterpart, Minister Shoigu, repeated to me in person that Russia has no intention of invading Ukraine, and while we will take them at their word, we must judge them by their actions. At our meeting, I also took the opportunity to address the proposals in Russia's draft treaty, because while this is not a return to normal UK relations, it is important that as one of Europe's biggest military powers, the UK maintains strong lines of communications with Russia in order to avoid miscalculation or the risk of inadvertent escalations. I also continue to speak regularly to my Ukrainian defence counterpart, Minister Reznikov, as we continue to support the armed forces of Ukraine. Since 2015, the UK has responded alongside the likes of Sweden and Canada to Russia's previous illegal occupation of Crimea with defence capability building, including training and reform. And as I announced to the House last month, Mr. Speaker, we took the decision to also provide lethal aid to Ukraine. This now means that alongside the United States, Canada, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania and the Netherlands, the United Kingdom has not just spoken but acted. I'm pleased with the efforts being made by a range of European leaders, including President Macron, to find a way through, as we must remain resolute in our commitment to NATO's formal response to the Russian draft treaties, which all NATO members signed up to. Intimidation and aggression, however, must not be rewarded. We should be under no illusion. The Russian forces have now amassed on Ukraine's borders 65% of all their land combat power. The formation present and the action of the Russian state to date not only threaten the integrity of a sovereign state, but undermine international law and the democratic values in which all of us in Europe so strongly believe. The Foreign Office has now relocated the embassy further west in the country and, as 2 weeks ago, advised all UK nationals should leave Ukraine via all means possible. The Ministry of Defence will continue to monitor Russian actions, support Ukrainian defensive efforts and contribute to NATO's response measures. We continue to hope, Mr. Speaker, President Putin will relent and pull back from an invasion, but we must prepare ourselves for the consequences if he does not. I will update the House as I have done so over the last few weeks, both in the Chamber and to colleagues online. Thank you.
Now come to Shadow Secretary of State, John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Defence Secretary has been busy in recent weeks, so I welcome his statement today. Can I also thank him for keeping the opposition parties updated on Ukraine during these very grave escalations of Russian military threats on the Ukrainian border. This is the most serious security crisis Europe has faced since the Cold War, and the Ukrainian people, citizens of a proud, independent and democratic country, face an utterly unprecedented threat from, as the Secretary has said, 2/3 of Russia's entire forces built up now on its borders. Mr. Speaker, there is unified UK political support for Ukraine's sovereignty and its territorial integrity in the face of this continuing Russian aggression. The government also has Labour's full support in helping Ukraine defend itself and in pursuing diplomacy, even at this 11th hour, and even though President Putin has proved more interested in disinformation than diplomacy. And we also fully support moves to reinforce the security of NATO allies, as the Labour leader and I told the Secretary-General at NATO HQ earlier this month. Mr. Speaker, President Putin wants to divide and weaken the West, to turn back the clock and re-establish Russian control over neighbouring countries. The real threat to President Putin and his Russian elites is Ukraine as a successful democracy, choosing for itself its trading and security links with the West. An attack on Ukraine is an attack on democracy. So we welcome the message from Munich at the weekend that any invasion will be met with massive sanctions in a swift, unified Western response. The European Union, of course, will lead on sanctions legislation for most European allies, especially to clamp down on finances or critical technologies for Russia. So how is the UK coordinating with the European Commission and Council? What meetings have UK ministers had to discuss this coordination? Mr. Speaker, the other message from Munich at the weekend was that allies stand ready for further talks, and the Defence Secretary said this afternoon, I am pleased with the efforts being made by a range of European leaders, including President Macron. But what diplomatic initiatives is our UK Prime Minister taking, befitting Britain as a leading member of the NATO alliance and a permanent member of the UN Security Council? With the most serious tensions and developments in the Donbass, why did the UK government remove UK staff from the OSCE monitoring mission there, when those from all other European countries have stayed to do a job which is more vital now than ever? The Defence Secretary said, quite rightly, we continue to support Ukrainian defensive efforts, including with lethal aid. So what more will the Defence Secretary now do with NATO to help Ukraine defend itself? Can he speed up action via the Ukraine naval agreement? How feasible is a no-fly zone? What consideration will he give to support for Ukrainian resistance? Mr. Speaker, we cannot stand up to Russian aggression abroad while accepting Russian corruption at home. For too long, Britain has been the destination for the dirty money that keeps Putin in power. So where is the economic crime bill, promised by the government and then pulled? Where is the comprehensive reform of Companies House? Where is the law to register foreign agents? Where is the Register of Overseas Entities bill? Where is the replacement for the outdated Computer Misuse Act? Where are the new rules on political donations? Why does the government's elections bill make these problems worse by enabling political donations from donors based overseas? Whether or not President Putin invades Ukraine, Russia's long-run pattern of aggression demands a NATO response. So can the Secretary of State report from his meeting last week with NATO defence ministers on how the alliance's overall posture is set to change? Can he explain what could be taken to better coordinate NATO with the Joint Expeditionary Force, for instance, creating a regional readiness force? And finally, does Ukraine not expose the flaws in the government's integrated review last year, with its first focus on the Indo-Pacific and with its plan to cut the British Army by another 10,000 soldiers? Will he now halt any further army cuts, and will he restore the highest defence priority to Europe, the North Atlantic and the Arctic?
I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman's support, and he will know that throughout this process we are grateful in the government, but also efforts to be united across this House has been one of the strongest messages we can send to Russia, as is we are united across NATO and indeed the EU to make sure that their behaviour is unacceptable. When the Right Honourable gentleman asked about sanctions, my Right Honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has been in conversation more than weekly with the EU on coordinating sanctions to make sure the EU Commission, who is obviously the lead on their sanctions, the United States and the United Kingdom are as close as possible in lockstep. The EU have obviously currently taken the position that they will prepare and deliver the sanctions should an invasion happen at that moment. The United States and certainly the United Kingdom has laid before this House their sanctions that they would put in place. That is a different of approach. However, we know from our own experience that the EU can move very quickly at a Commission level when it wishes to do so. And there is no loss of appetite or lack of appetite in the EU to deal with President Putin through sanctions should he make the tragic error of invading Ukraine. And I don't think anyone should play into the differences of timing to suggest that. It is just a simple mechanism of approach. My Right Honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, also through a group called the Quint++, that is the US, UK, Italy, France and Germany, plus NATO and the EU, are all working together on those type of responses, and they are regularly having discussions. On the issue of OSCE, I can get the exact, I will write to the Right Honourable gentleman about it, but I know that one individual has been in touch. He is obviously a UK citizen, and when the Foreign Office advice was issued, there are certain, obviously, advices to citizens of our country, and if you find yourself in any organisation, obviously, that is our advice to them. However, other members of the OSCE have left, not all of them, but I will get him the full details as well. When it comes to the bigger questions of issues like aid, Ukrainian resistance and further support, he will know that it has been best pursued in a bilateral basis between countries or groupings of countries, such as through lethal aid. There's been much made of the fact that countries such as Germany and France have not done lethal aid to Ukraine. I simply reflect, as I did at NATO last week, that the strength of an alliance of 30 is we can all play to our strengths. That is important that we recognise that not every country in their political systems or their political leadership is going to have the same view, but as an alliance of 30, we can play to our strengths and we can deliver to Ukraine what it needs. And we've seen, for example, an increase in aid to Ukraine from the likes of Germany, as well as medical supplies. And in other countries such as the United Kingdom and the Baltic states, obviously lethal aid plays a part of that. And I think that's really important, Mr. Speaker, in order to keep going together at the same speed. We recognise that if we're going to tackle Russia, we have to be able to play to that strength. The EU has a strong role to play in helping the resilience of neighbouring countries, such as through migrant flows in Belarus, etc. If 1 million refugees appear in Hungary or Romania or Poland, I would urge the EU needs to step up and think about what it's going to do about millions of refugees on their soil, rather than think about it afterwards. And I think that's where the EU Commission can play a strong role in resilience building. In other areas, his comments on the integrated review. Look, I actually think it's the opposite. If you read the full integrated review and the Defence Command paper, what it showed was we have to be ready. And what it shows is that Russia and adversaries like Russia, they don't go with a big bang and just arrive in a big invasion. They soften up their targets using sub-threshold methods in cyber, in corruption and organised crime, etc. And they turn up incrementally. Many of the forces that we see now massed on Ukraine's border were in fact pre-positioned in April following an exercise, and then their troops went home to barracks. That allowed them to be ready and to deploy in days, while NATO's traditional model has been weeks and months for us to deploy. That's why in our Defence Command paper we put a premium on speed and readiness, and if sometimes that premium means a less mass, that's why we have an alliance to pick up on that. We have an alliance of 30 countries. We way outspend Russia collectively as a group of nations and indeed capabilities, and it's why I'm now able to offer our NATO leaders true forces that will actually turn up on the day, rather than what we had even in my day when I was serving in West Germany or North Germany, which was fictional numbers, but actually when you press the button, instead of a division, you got a brigade. And I think that is far more important to show strength to the Russians that we mean what we say and we can deliver on that. I was Security Minister, Mr. Speaker, when I introduced the Criminals Finance Act. There was no more greater champion on taking down dirty money in the city than me. I brought in the unexplained wealth orders. I brought in the mobile stores of wealth where people got round it, and in fact helped set up the national, within the National Crime Agency, the Economic Crime Unit. I also made sure that we changed the law around tax evasion to make sure we got more people, and pushed incredibly hard and successfully through the, I think it was the G7, the Transparent Register of Beneficial Ownership. He's absolutely right, we need to do more. I absolutely supported at the time, and still do, a register of foreign agents, and I am, the whole of government is now looking at those issues, and I think he is totally right around areas like Companies House. The government is committed to do something about it. I expect an announcement soon on a range of those issues, but he's right that the consequences of Russia's action, going way back to Salisbury and before, is that we must stop the oligarchs and their dirty money resident in this country behaving as a place of refuge when in fact they should not be welcome. And if it comes to an invasion of Ukraine, Russia should know what it costs to be isolated.
Theresa May.
Speaker, can I commend my right honourable friend and the government for the robust stance which they have been taking alongside our American and European allies in the face of Russia's threats against Ukraine. President Putin wants to weaken NATO and the Western alliance, but does my right honourable friend agree with me that any further action to invade Ukrainian territory by the Russians can only lead to a strengthening of the determination of the UK, NATO and the Western alliance to defend the rights of sovereign states and to defend democracy?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right, and I have to say, when I was her security minister, it was her support that allowed us to sometimes overrule the Treasury to get some of those legislations through to deal with the Criminal Finances Act. My right honourable friend is absolutely right. In 2014, after the invasion of Crimea, President Putin got exactly the opposite of what he wanted. He got more forces on the east of Europe. He got more defence spending. If he continues down this line, I suspect he'll continue to get more forces on his border and greater defence spending across NATO, the very opposite of what he is trying to intend to do. I hope he learns a lesson of 2015. At the moment, it's not looking well. Good.
SNP spokesperson Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary for advance sight of the statement and the updates he's been giving opposition parties over the previous weeks, and underline that on these benches we are friends of Ukraine, we are supporters of international law, and we support absolutely Ukraine's right and ability to organise its security affairs as it sees fit. But as the Russian Security Council meeting happening as we've been sat in this chamber this afternoon shows us, we have reached a dangerous moment in all of this. The Secretary has mentioned the new sanctions package that was announced by the government just before the recess. And when that package was announced, it stated, quote, that it will give the government the ability to sanction entities and individuals of economic and strategic interest to Russia, but only if there is a further escalation. Well, that escalation has started, Mr. Speaker, and we saw that yesterday, Saturday and on Friday, anyone who was following events in the Donbass region. So isn't it time to start sanctioning individuals and entities of strategic interest now, including those here in this country? And given the importance that disinformation and the entire architecture that the Russian government has to spread disinformation to the conflict it's perpetrating against Ukraine, shouldn't that start with some of those disinformation rackets here, the likes of RT, Sputnik and others, now?
The honourable gentleman is absolutely right, and I think the new leader of ALBA may like to reflect on his celebrity status on some of those channels. I think what I would say to the honourable gentleman is the government already does have some considerable powers. The Magnitsky sanctions that have been used against a number of Russian individuals after Salisbury. In fact, some of the people I met in the Russian Ministry of Defence themselves were sanctioned under a range of those measures, and we do continue to deliver them. But on the wider response, the whole of government will produce a response to this House in due course. I understand his point about should we not do sanctions now rather than wait for it to happen. I think that the key here is that we have to be in a position to threaten to deliver sanctions against Russia if they do something. If we were to unilaterally deliver them now, and America wasn't and European Union wasn't, I think there is a danger that President Putin would play into a divide and rule narrative that he is trying to do. I think that there are plenty of measures we can take. We are planning some serious set of sanctions, and I think that the reality and the question to President Putin is, do you actually care what's going to happen to your people? Because it will be them that suffers most as a result of the sanctions, and it will be interesting, as a responsible leader, whether he will listen to that.
The Select Committee to Selden.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, could I welcome this statement? The penny was dropping at the Munich Security Conference that this is not just about Ukraine, but a wider realignment of global power, with the formation of a new Russia-China alliance that is fueling Putin's adventurism and indeed perhaps taking us towards another Cold War. The money laundering issues aside, which must go ahead, absolutely, could I ask the Secretary of State to look at the issues of sanctions? Because there is a concern we are actually helping Putin in his intention of turning Russia away from the West and towards a new alliance with China in the long-term future.
If Russia wants to be dependent on China, then I think they will recognise that will be a wrong decision. China and Russia are directly in competition over the high north and the route through the Arctic, and Russia surely will not want to depend entirely on China in the same way many European states are regretting being entirely dependent on Russian gas. I think it's important, however, that we do a range of sanctions that not only are directed at the regime and the government of Russia, but also at some of their bankers or their people that help them carry on as normal.
Ben Bradshaw.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I fully support what the Defence Secretary said and the response of the Shadow Defence Secretary. But as the architect of unexplained wealth orders, he must share the widespread frustration that not a single one has been issued under the current Prime Minister. Not a single Russian who was given a golden visa has been named. Why does he think we've been so slow at tackling dirty Russian money in London?
Look, unexplained wealth orders are not a matter for politicians. They are a matter for the investigators, the National Crime Agency and economic crime. I can no more direct an unexplained wealth order than he can, although when I was Security Minister I was victim of a Russian fraud that tried to purport me having a conversation with the Russian Prosecutor General and directing them. So I am disappointed there are not as many as I had hoped. The legislation was taken through. They are a very powerful model. They have been used on some pretty unsavoury people, and I'm delighted they have been. But he is right. There are not enough to be used. We are quite unique in having them. There aren't many other countries, and we should do more. And I think we should understand why the NCA has not delivered as many as we had hoped. I think there are other tools to look at. I certainly welcome that long-term commitment on beneficial ownership. I think the Companies House legislation is something that we'll see soon. I remember being horrified to discover that pretty much even a sanctioned individual could open a company, because I don't even think in those days they were given an identity check. That has to stop. I know they've done some tightening up. It will take legislation, and I hope the whole House will support that.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I say to my right honourable friend, I recommend his calm and straightforward posture during the course of this, and I think he's done incredibly well. Can I also say to him this, though, that in the course of all of our debates and even on TV, we behave as though Russia is threatening to invade Ukraine. Russia has already invaded Ukraine. They took the Crimea, and they're right now furnishing the Donbass region with munitions to create even further trouble. So when we look at it like this, what worries me slightly is that lots of foreign leaders going over to see Mr. Putin, which is what he wants to do, and then we may just get this position where there's a little scintilla of a little question that says, well, maybe we won't let Ukraine in if they wanted to come into NATO. Maybe we'll make it clear that this is not something that they could get. Can I just get an absolute assurance from my honourable friend that the UK government believes that if the democratically elected government of the Ukraine wishes to do anything and asked to do it, they will be entertained no worse than any other country would do.
My right honourable friend makes a powerful point, and we should be true to our values. And the Prime Minister was very clear at Munich that the point he raises is absolutely the case. It is also the case that the NATO response to Russia, which was all 30 members, was very clear on that. We shall hold each other to that commitment, and I think it is absolutely right that now is the time to stand up and say these are our values, they are not up for compromise, we're not going to give a single inch, and fundamentally we are not going to reward a bully.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State said a moment ago, he talked about sanctions on Russia if they do something. Can I just press him on this point? We don't yet know for sure whether full invasion will take place, but can he tell the House what the government's response would be if the action taken by Russia, say, took the form of a no-fly zone over Ukraine, or blockading of its ports, or repeated and significant cyber attacks on Ukrainian institutions and governments? In those circumstances, would the government respond with the full sanctions that it's obviously been discussing?
I'm grateful to that honourable member. First of all, let me make something clear. As he knows, there's lots of sanctions already in place after Crimea. So these are about additional sanctions on top of the raft of sanctions the government brought in after that illegal invasion and annexation of Crimea and indeed the Donbass. Look, I think he is absolutely right. Look, many of these aggressive moves, like a no-fly zone, in other words, the threatening of the integrity of that sovereign state, a blockade to free trade, would absolutely warrant a response ranging from sanctions and others. I think we would look at it at the time, but absolutely I agree with him. Be under no illusion, Russia should be under no illusion that threatening the integrity of a sovereign nation, whether that's in the air or on the sea, is exactly the same as threatening it on the land.
Dr. Liam Fox.
Following the first invasion in 2014, and in order to get round sanctions, Russia has had extensive import substitution and investment in European companies in critical infrastructure and energy, a policy of tolerance, if not appeasement, by European governments. Can I say to my right honourable friend, who I think has been an exemplary Defence Secretary through this crisis, that sanctions alone will not protect Ukraine from a subsequent Russian invasion? They need either substantial improvements in their defence capabilities or a security guarantee, or both. President Putin believes that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. There is no lack of clarity there, and ultimately he can only be deterred by the threatened use of force.
The government's taken a position, as have NATO, that it's about deterrence and diplomacy, and deterrence does involve the recognition that shoring up NATO members with resilience and containment measures to make sure that Russia is contained should it make that foolish mistake of invasion of Ukraine is upheld. That is done by our forces. That's why we've made available even more, including 1,000 members of the army on standby, currently in the UK, to send elsewhere. But I also think he is right that this, at the heart of this, is about defending Ukraine's right to choose. Not what it does with that right, but fundamentally a democratic nation has chosen something. We should respect that. And we are on the cusp of an invasion of a democratic country in Europe. That should worry us all.
Jamie Stone.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for an advance copy of the statement. Now, let's be clear about this. If Russia invades Ukraine, there will quite rightly be massive sanctions placed on Russia. And if that happens, we can expect a salvo of cyber attacks on the United Kingdom. So I seek two reassurances from the Secretary of State. Firstly, that we have the best possible defences against cyber attacks, but also what is good for the goose is good for the gander. If necessary, we can use cyber warfare to give as good as we get back to Russia.
The Defence Command paper published last year set out plans to establish and grow to a significant size the National Cyber Force, which is the United Kingdom's offensive cyber capability to complement our defensive capability. That is a joint GCHQ and defence agency. It will be based in the northwest of England. It has already been established and starting to grow. I can't comment on the operations it will undertake. I'm a soldier. I was always taught the best part of defence is offence.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. What will the government do to try and impress on President Putin that even if he invades the rest of the Ukraine without military comeback on behalf of Ukraine, it would be a fatal error for him then to think that he could invade an outlying NATO state, one of the Baltic states, for example, without an attack on one rightly being considered to be an attack on all NATO members?
President Putin's public stated view is that, in fact, by potentially dealing with Ukraine or preventing Ukraine joining NATO, he is in fact saving us all from a future war, because he wrongly asserts that should Ukraine join NATO, Ukraine would then attack Crimea and the Donbass, and that would trigger a NATO. My right honourable friend is absolutely an expert on NATO. He knows that it's just a fantasy scenario, but potentially used as a justification. And I think it's therefore very important we demonstrate that, yes, with Ukraine not being in NATO, we, however, can do our best to protect their right to choose, but also that we make sure it very, very crystal clear to the President of Russia that, try this with NATO partners, and no matter how big and how small, Article 5 is a reality.
Barry Sherman.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm particularly fearful of the possibility of an outbreak of war in Europe. I was born not far from here during the worst blitz of the war with Nazi Germany. And every time I think about war, I remember my family, my father away at war, bombs raining down, killing our neighbours. So no one can give me lectures on this. We must show these despots and dictators firmly that we mean business in every sense. Will he join me in sending that message to Putin?
And I've been very consistent, and like him, and like a number of my colleagues on this side of the House and on the front bench, and indeed some on your side, whether you have been born in a Second World War environment or you have seen people at the wrong end of a terrorist attack or death and destruction, no one comes here glowing with warmongering in their heart. They come here trying to do their very best to avoid it. But of course, we also know that freedom comes at a cost. Freedom is not free, as the South Koreans know and put on their war memorials. And we have to stand up to this, because we didn't stand up in 2014 as an international community. We didn't stand up as an international community enough. We did send a very successful and strong message after Salisbury poisoning, and 153 intelligence officers were expelled. But, the ripples of this being successful for President Putin will not end. They will go through us all, and we will all regret it in the long run. And sometimes that means taking a stand, and I think now's the time.
Bob Stewart.
Oh, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I understand that the Duma passed a resolution that the Donbass and the Crimea were to be incorporated into Russia. This in some way gives Putin some sort of legality if he was to think of invading. If Putin was to replace the so-called little green men in the Donbass with regular Russian soldiers, could we expect NATO and the West to respond with just as much severity when we're talking about sanctions as if he'd invaded the remainder of Ukraine?
Look, I think we have, as you say, put in a raft of sanctions already. I think Russian regulars have come and gone in Donbass already. They're already heavily based in Crimea to a significant number. They take it as their own. This latest Donbass, I think it's a resolution about the Donbass in the Duma, is of course worrying, and we should all recognise that this is effectively a motion over a sovereign state they have no legal international law authority over, and we should not recognise it. The Prime Minister has been very clear that 1 inch over the border on this incursion will lead to the sanctions. 1 boot, 1 tank, 1 vehicle, and we won't accept it as anything other than an invasion. It's not an interversion, it's not an incursion, it's an invasion, and we will stick to that line.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. At this incredibly dangerous time, I noticed that the Defence Secretary did not mention or say much about the Minsk agreement. Does he think this is a way that we can go back to further talks? And would he be prepared to countenance, if the Russians pull back, any reduction in the NATO presence on the border as well, in order to bring about a longer-term secure peace in the region?
So, the right honourable gentleman raised the point about Minsk. I was very clear on Minsk, both in my press conference in Moscow and indeed elsewhere. Both Russia and Ukraine signed Minsk. He will know that in those type of treaties, such as we found with the Good Friday Agreement, the treaty is one thing. Rolling up your sleeves and delivering the sequences in the right way is the big challenge. We all remember that from things like decommissioning in Northern Ireland. Easy to write a Good Friday Agreement, hard to deliver. Same for the Minsk Agreement. But we all recognise that the Minsk Agreement is one of the ways through. It should be. We should do our best to support it being implemented as a way out. On his other point about pulling back NATO, we didn't put 165,000 combat troops on the edge of a sovereign country and hold a gun to the head of a democratically elected government. We didn't do that. Russia did that. We have nothing to de-escalate from. Russia does. And I do hope the right honourable gentleman might condemn the Stop the War coalition, who seems to always paint us as the aggressor. Maybe he'd like to go and ask the people of Ukraine what he actually thinks who the aggressor is.
John Whittingdale.
Can my right honourable friend say whether increased military activity has been detected in other Russian-controlled areas, such as Transnistria, as well as Crimea and Kaliningrad? And what assessment has he made of the possible threat, if not now, then in the future, against other former Soviet states which are outside of NATO, such as Moldova?
It's been a long-running challenge, Russia's malign activity. We've packaged it up and called it malign activity, but we have seen it in the likes of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and we should not forget in all of this that Bosnia-Herzegovina is on a very fragile position at the moment. It is in an impoverished state. The minorities are already starting to agitate, and Russia's influence into some of the separatists could have the potential of sending us all back to the early 90s. Russia's malign activity does no good, and it not only challenges our European values, but it also challenges both the wealth of those states, and for no apparent reason, it seems, other than to just weaken people who think differently from them.
Chris Bryant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I fear things have moved on yet further today. Mr Medvedev has said two things which are very disturbing. First, that it will be perfectly possible to recognise the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk. And secondly, that, of course, there might be sanctions, but we'd be able to, or Russia will be able to wear it, because after all, after 2014, after the invasion of Crimea and after their military action in Georgia, they were able to wear whatever the West threw at them. Can he confirm that only a third of those areas that I've just referred to are presently held by separatists? So recognising or trying to enforce some independence for those areas would mean a very significant invasion of Ukrainian territory, including areas that are not presently held by separatists at all. Secondly, that Ukrainians, if anything, are more determined now than ever to face towards the West because of precisely what President Putin has been doing over these years. And whatever comes, if there is an invasion of any kind, any troops, as he's already said, the reaction is going to have to be a damn sight harder than it was in 2014, isn't it?
Look, I think he's right on his last point. It absolutely has to be harder and unified and stick to it. I think often the calculation in Russia is we'll all get bored and 6 months later everything will go back to normal. On the sanctions point, Minister Shoigu said to my face that the sanctions can't harm them. They will just either go elsewhere or they're resilient. That is, unfortunately, the view in some of the leadership of the Russian government. I doubt it's the view of the Russian people that have to suffer the consequences of that. And I think we should also recognise the consequence for the wider world of this invasion. Yemen gets about 20% of its food from Ukrainian grain. Libya gets about 44% of its food from Ukrainian grain. What would happen to those countries with rising food prices, shortage of food, is a horrible consequence that we must do everything to avoid. This is a global problem. Ukraine matters. Our strength of resolve matters, because as he and I will know, there are other bigger countries looking at how much resolve we have to stand by our values.
Alicia Cairns.
I'd like to thank the government and civil society organisations for all they're doing to expose false flag and disinformation efforts from the Kremlin. But Putin has just finished his extraordinary meeting of the Security Council, where again overwhelming support has been given to recognise the independence of the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. Before he announces his plans tonight, will my right honourable friend please call this out for what it is, a dangerous precursor to the illegal annexation of these lands? And will he also confirm that despite our focus on preventing further invasion, we do not tacitly accept that those territories currently illegally held are rightly Russian?
We all accept that the 2014 invasion of the Donbass and Crimea was an invasion of a sovereign territory, and nothing changes that. And all our NATO allies agree on that entirely and have recognised not 1 inch of those lands, including, by the way, China has still not recognised the Donbass. That's an important message, I think, to President Putin. For all of our issues with China, I do not think wants an economic schism in the heart of Europe at this moment in time, and I think that is something that hopefully President Putin will rely on. Look, all of these plans, whether it is annexation of part of Ukraine, whether it is false flags of people having to be evacuated or Ukrainian attacks on things, they're all false. They're all designed to cause an excuse or a friction. The worrying thing is we can all see it. You don't have to be an expert in Europe to spot what's going on. The worry for us is that President Putin thinks that it doesn't matter or thinks that he can get away with it.
Kevin Jones.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Can I first of all commend the Defence Secretary for his actions over the last few months. He mentioned in his statement the Russian playbook, and one of it is to portray that somehow the false narrative around the sovereignty of the Ukraine. Is he confident enough that we in the West have an ability to push back against these false narratives, and particularly on social media, which seem to infect the debate which is currently taking place?
We certainly have the capability, and we do everything we can, both internationally and indeed unilaterally, to try and make sure the messages get not only across to our own audiences, but also importantly to the Ukrainians and indeed the Russian audience. We could start close to home. We could ask the leader of Alba on his next Russia Today programme to do an in-depth analysis of exactly some of these false claims and broadcast it. I mean, I'm sure he's open to the highest bidder, so we'll be very happy to do that. But I think it's really important that we recognise in this era, information is as powerful as every tank, and we have to make sure that the people of Russia, the ordinary people of Russia and the people of Ukraine are not denied free and fair press in order to get across the message about what is going on in their country in their name.
Crispin Blunt.
In today's circumstances, what obligations does Her Majesty's Government feel it accepts under the Budapest Memorandum?
The Budapest Memorandum, as my right honourable friend will know, was an agreement to effectively for Ukraine to disarm its nuclear weapons in exchange for Russia's recognition of their sovereignty. If Russia breaches that, and you could argue it already has with its invasion, then I would guess that the memorandum, I'm not an international lawyer, but would become pretty much null and void. We are one of the, I think, signatory guarantors of that, which is why we're doing so much now to hold them to account. And as I said in questions and in the statement, let us not forget, Russia, including, I think, Prime Minister or President Medvedev, whichever role he was filling, in 2010 at the Astana summit, signed up alongside the international community to recognise that every participating state is free to choose or change its security arrangements, including treaties and alliances. That's what they signed up to then. Never mind these conspiracy theories that somebody somewhere said that NATO would never expand. We've never seen any proof of that. We've never seen any documents. What we have seen is at least 4 statements and treaties signed by Russia over the many years that says it respects the sovereignty of countries to choose. We hold them to it.
Sammy Wilson.
Speaker. First of all, can I congratulate the Minister in the leading role which he has played in rallying the opposition to Russia's aggression towards the Ukraine. We already know that many European nations, of course, find it difficult because they have allowed themselves to be subject to energy blackmail through their zero carbon policy. But Russian aggression against Ukraine threatens the strategic supplies of food in the world, because Ukraine is the third biggest producer or exporter of grain at 100 million tonnes per year. What assessment has he done about the areas of the world which are most likely to be affected if aggression should lead to that food not being available? And does he not agree that it underlines the strategic importance of Ukraine and the importance of giving every support to allow them to defend their independence, their democracy and their vital economic role?
The honourable gentleman is absolutely right. It's not just about gas. I mean, we've focused on gas because predominantly it's what preoccupies us in our comfy part of Europe. But in many countries in the world, it's about food and it's about other cost of living crises, some of which are far more pressing about whether or not we can afford the potential increase of gas. And we should not forget this implication goes right across the world, certainly the Western world, if we don't deal with it and deter it. And I think it's very important. And, you know, the Prime Minister at Munich was absolutely clear with everyone, including the President of Ukraine, that we would stand by Ukraine, that we must be resolved together, both as Europe and as NATO. We mustn't salami slice ourselves away on different thought. And I know that when the Prime Minister speaks to his European counterparts, he is very much focused on this sense of unanimous and strong alliance challenging the assertion, because it is the case that if we don't deter today, we will all pay for it tomorrow.
Bill Wigan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for the work that he and the Prime Minister have done on this. Having visited Georgia and seen for myself what Russian incursions look like, if the Ukraine is invaded, will Georgia be admitted to NATO?
Well, look, it's for Georgia and its relationship with NATO and NATO collectively to recognise its decision, or whether it does accede. Fundamentally, as the Prime Minister has been clear, as he knows, that it is about maintaining the open door policy of Ukraine, of sovereign states. And I said to the Russians very clearly, you know, NATO doesn't go around choosing people. People choose NATO. They choose our values, and that's how it's done. There is no secret plot to go around undermining or dividing Russia. And the question for President Putin should be, why is it all those countries wanted to join NATO in the first place? It wasn't to collect a badge. It was because they felt under threat by a nation that did not want to respect their sovereignty and their democracy and their freedom.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Secretary of State for his statement? The situation is clearly very grave, but he obviously has a pretty clear view of the situation on the ground. The wife of my constituent is stuck in Ukraine near the Russian border, and she can't complete a medical assessment or enrol biometrics to complete a spousal visa. And because he isn't in Ukraine, they can't use the family migration route. So what pressure can he bring to bear on the Home Office to ensure that if the situation escalates, as seems inevitable, our military aren't left to evacuate citizens and families?
Look, if my learned member just obviously sends me the details, I will be very, very happy to take it up and look at it for her.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Tonight, can I too commend my right honourable friend and the Minister for the fantastic job they're doing in very difficult circumstances. If Russia does invade, countries, NATO countries, particularly the smaller ones, particularly the Baltic countries, will need our reassurance. Does my right honourable friend foresee further deployments of British troops to these countries? And if he does, would it not be hugely reassuring to him if he had 10,000 more troops in his back pocket?
Well, tonight, Madam Deputy Speaker, we are hosting the 10 nations of the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is the Nordic states, plus Iceland, plus Holland. We will be hosting them tonight and tomorrow at a summit, and I have invited from across the House colleagues from the Labour front bench, the Scottish National Party and the Liberal Democrats, because I think it is important that we recognise the importance they have to us as our allies, and they are the ones on that front line. He is right that they will be the ones most worried. They are, some of them, territories that President Putin and his like have often felt are not territories. And if you, as I've referred to colleagues before, if you look at President Putin's essay of July last year, of course, that is one of the consequences, I fear, of President Putin being successful in Ukraine, is where do the ripples land next? We will need forces to do that. We've been managing to double up that into a brigade. The enhanced forward presence, which are 4 battle groups that currently exist, multinational, I suspect they will grow, will be open to more suggestions.
Clive Efford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We should be moving against Russian dirty money in the City of London, regardless of what happens in Ukraine. And I don't doubt the Secretary of State's determination to deal with that as he's expressed it today. But the lack of activity suggests that there are others in government who do not share his determination. So can he assure us that should there be an invasion even tonight, that we are ready to take action against that dirty money?
Look, it won't have missed anyone in this House that we are all vulnerable to not only dirty money, but to illicit lobbying or influence by foreign agents. All of us in this House, we have to wake up to the threat of sub-threshold challenges, whether that's money, whether that's corruption, whether that's political interference. All of us. And I'm not going to throw stones in glass houses, but all of us on this side of the House and your side of the House know what that looks like. We have to have more transparency as the beginning of that process, and we have to enact some of the laws we already have. And I'll be very happy on his behalf to engage with the National Crime Agency to see what more we can do.
If we have shorter questions and therefore the Secretary of State can give shorter answers, we will be able to get everyone in this statement. If not, I'm afraid some people will be disappointed because, as you can see, people are coming in for the next item of business. But this is important, and I would like to give everybody the chance to speak. Shorter, please. Richard Graham.
Madam Deputy Speaker, when Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said that sovereignty must be respected, and that includes Ukraine, does my right honourable friend believe that this will encourage President Putin to hold back? And should he still invade, what impact will that have on Sino-Russian relationships, and how concerned should we be for Taiwan?
My right honourable friend said, answer that in 5 words. I think it's a very important message from China to Russia, and he should listen to it. But of course, the most important message is that we demonstrate resolve about protecting our values, because whatever we don't or do in this part of the world, China is watching.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State is being slightly more gracious about the work of European leaders in trying to find a diplomatic solution, but just a week or so ago he was saying that those efforts had a whiff of Munich about them. Does he want to apologise for that remark, which was not only crass, but it also undermines efforts to deliver Minsk II as the starting point for our best chance of avoiding war? And will he accept that if the government is serious about playing a constructive role, it should start by getting its own house in order, first of all by repaying the almost £2 million which his party has received in Russian donations since the Prime Minister took office, and will he finally end London's role in hiding the proceeds of Kremlin-connected corruption?
The Honourable Lady, I'm sure the Honourable Lady understands what I meant when I said if President Putin invades Ukraine, there would be a whiff of Munich, because of course Munich was 2 parts. It was the appeasement, but it was also the fact that all the way through Hitler lied and had a plan to aggressively invade large parts of Europe. And my point I was making was if he invaded, as I put in my own article, then we would be chasing a straw man when all along President Putin had a predetermined plan. So I suggest, before she makes those sort of allegations, that she goes back to the history books, understand what Munich was about, and then she'll understand what I was saying. Because what we do know here is that time and time again, President Putin has ignored international law, ignored human rights, invaded countries, murdered British people on these streets through his orders in the GRU, and all she can do here is come here, stand up and tell us that we're in the wrong. Maybe she should go to Moscow and tell it themselves.
John Barron.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I know my right honourable friend will agree. That
jaw is preferable to war. But does he accept that given Russian ambitions regarding Ukraine and events elsewhere, including the South China Sea, that the time has come finally for the UK to accept that we need to substantially increase our defence spending on a sustainable long-term basis, because jaw is far more effective if you've got a strong armed forces?
The Prime Minister supported and delivered the biggest increase in defence spending since the Cold War. The £24 billion extra was also to modernise our armed forces, as well as to make sure we were able to enter new domains where we are threatened by both Russia and other adversaries. That is the right track. We've always been consistent, as has the Prime Minister, which is fundamentally, if the threat changes, we should always be open to review. I think that's important. We should also recognise that we achieve our strength in the West through our alliances on our values and alliances on our defence spending. NATO is the best alliance for that. It is the keystone of European security. Our spending outstrips Russia, and our forces do as well. The only thing that we must make sure we continue is resolve. Resolve is what this crisis is about. We're resolved, the Prime Minister is resolved, the United Kingdom is resolved. We're going to stand up for our values against Putin's aggression.
Dave Dugan.
Deputy Speaker, from a logistical perspective, what efforts are being made to ramp up the provision of the Ukrainian military's specific requests for additional equipment and parts from the Ministry of Defence? How is this resource being coordinated with international partners to secure all the required resources and kit needed for the Ukrainians to defend themselves, and how are they being trained in its use?
I'm in constant contact with my defence counterpart in Ukraine. We talk regularly. The Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary has been incredibly supportive. We're currently at the stage where we have supplied, as I talked about, the anti-tank weapons and other non-lethal equipment. Britain has been side by side with Ukraine since 2014-15, so there's been significant amounts of training and capacity building, and we will continue to look at what other options are available. We have those discussions. Where we can, we meet their demand. Where not, we try and help other people meet it.
Robert Jenrick.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for the leadership that he's shown in recent months? And the paradox is that the more that Putin tries to draw countries towards Moscow, the more he repels them. And the more he revitalises the very alliance that he says he's most afraid of, NATO. But can I ask him specifically on sanctions? Will the UK, when it brings forward its package, ensure that they are synced with those from the United States, include action to prevent UK banks from handling foreign currency transfers from Russian state-owned banks, and include, as I know colleagues in the United States Senate would like to, specific sanctions against Nord Stream 2?
The President of the United States was very clear that he will stop Nord Stream 2. I listened to that press conference like everybody. Also, on the raft of sanctions the government has brought forward, they are intelligently targeted. They build on already existing sanctions after Crimea, but of course we'll continue to keep those measures under review.
Williams.
Speaker, Mr. Putin is actually holding an unscheduled meeting with the Russian Security Council today, which he says in fact will decide on the recognition of the two breakaway republics. What would be the implication for the Minsk protocols of such an eventuality?
Well, I think, as I said to the honourable gentleman from Islington, we do urge both parties to have regard to the Minsk agreement. The Russians only a few weeks ago were saying it should be at the Minsk agreement. I think some of those measures go exactly against the Minsk agreement, and perhaps that is a clue to maybe what the real intention is.
Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, when last month I was in Donetsk Oblast with some members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, there was some sniper fire across the line of contact from Russian supporting forces. But what assessment has my right honourable friend made of recent false flag operations in recent days and indeed recent hours?
Shouldn't forget, the Ukrainians have had 10,000 people killed since the invasion of the Donbass. 10,000 people, often weekly or every month, on that line of control, young men and women who are simply guarding their border. The false flag operations have been growing. I think there is a worrying trend that what we've seen recently fits the bill or the playbook of what we can expect as the Russian government potentially seeks to destabilise and confuse the picture. We're not confused. We know what 160,000 troops mean, and so does the international community.
Rachel Maskell.
Madam Deputy Speaker, maintaining a diplomatic focus is absolutely crucial at this time, but could the government say what diplomatic focus they're bringing to Russian allies across the world? I haven't heard the Defence Secretary talk about that.
Well, the marked difference between Russia is they don't have any allies. Belarus is their only ally. By your friends you shall be judged. Belarus is it. That's one of the problems for Russia. It fails to recognise that international alliances are a sign of both civilised society and human rights. If you want to be on your own and stuff everyone else, you end up like North Korea. We would try and use our allies. We are certainly trying people who have more influence than others, but fundamentally it's going to be in the mind of President Putin what he does next.
Andrew Bridgen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. To what extent does my right honourable friend believe the undignified withdrawal from Afghanistan by ourselves and our allies has emboldened President Putin and contributed to setting in train events that are now unfolding on the Ukraine border?
President Putin wrote his article last July before the Afghanistan withdrawal, so I think that is the biggest symbol of what his ambitions were. But it is absolutely the case that people who don't agree with our values sniff lack of resolve and take action. That's why we have to be resolved.
Margaret Ferrier.
Madam Deputy Speaker, what assessment has the government made of the threat against vulnerable minorities in the Ukraine, such as religious or ethnic minorities or members of the LGBTQ+ community? What discussions has the government had with international allies about preventing widespread human rights abuses in the event of an invasion?
In the event of an invasion, it doesn't matter whether you're a minority or a majority. The Russian government's attitude to those people that disagree with them, either at home or in another country, is woeful and dangerous.
Peter Bone.
Mr. Speaker, with the Russian military action in Transnistria, does the Secretary of State agree that Moldova is also at risk from the Russians, and has there been discussions with their government?
Countries are at risk, often embolden President Putin, which is why one of the reasons we are where we are today is post-2014, 2015. Maybe the West was not tough enough on that initial invasion. Moldova, many other countries, smaller countries in NATO, Bosnia-Herzegovina are all causes for concern, and we must therefore recognise that now is not the moment to take the eye off the ball of places far away of which we sometimes know nothing.
Jim Shannon.
Can I thank the Secretary of State for his answers to the questions? With the latest news regarding Russian Security Council meetings that invasion is imminent, will the Secretary of State underline what human aid support is available for the ordinary, decent people of Ukraine? What has been done to provide medical supplies for the civilian casualties, which will undoubtedly be high when civilian militias are giving young and old with no weapons training arms to try and save their country?
First of all, I think we should have real admiration for the bravery of many of those people. And if you saw the President of Ukraine's speech at Ukraine, almost a desperate attempt to rally people to be more supportive. A number of countries, including Germany, for example, have supported with field hospitals and medical assistance. That is as important as lethal aid. We will do what we can, and I know many other nations are.
Raymond Shishti.
The stance and leadership the Secretary of State has taken with regards to preserving our international rules-based system. With regards to a specific issue where there is a loophole where Russia gets its money from, under the IMF's SDR, special drawing rights, $650 billion last year were allocated to states around the world, and Russia got $17.5 billion. I and my US counterpart, Congressman Hill from Little Rock, wrote to our respective governments asking them to put conditions to IMF SDR allocations. Will the Secretary of State now re-look at that issue so that we can look at all loopholes along with firm sanctions?
My honourable friend, the Chief Secretary of the Treasury is here, will have heard that question. I will be delighted to refer it to the Treasury.
Mr.
Speaker, Russia's already clearly mounting an absolutely massive disinformation campaign, especially through social media. Does my right honourable friend agree that it's vital that we and our allies communicate very clearly to Russians, Ukrainians and our own domestic audience that our and NATO's actions are very simple? They're about Ukraine's right to self-determination and sovereignty and essential to maintaining peace in Europe.
It's absolutely about the right to choose. And don't just take it from me, take it from the President of Finland, who made an outstanding speech in New Year's Day about that right.
Jameson. Mr. Speaker, thank you. History's proven that conflict between near peer or peer adversaries gets very ugly. While I accept that NATO's potential for direct intervention is limited due to Article 5, what planning has been conducted for a possible cross-border refugee and humanitarian catastrophe?
It's incredibly important that NATO seeks to use the extra troops to provide both resilience, reassurance and containment. One of the reasons we have up to 400 Royal Marines in Poland is to assist Poland should a catastrophe happen and huge amounts of refugees pour across the border. I would urge the European Commission to make deep plans about what it's going to do with potentially massive migrant flows in a light of scale we have not seen since the Second World War.
Before we come to the statement on COVID, I would like to point out that the British Sign Language interpretation of proceedings is available to watch on Parliament Live TV. We now come to the statement. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I'll make a statement on our strategy for living with COVID. And before I begin, I know the whole House will join me in sending our best wishes to Her Majesty the Queen for a full and swift recovery. It is a reminder that this virus has not gone away. But because of the efforts we've made as a country over the past 2 years, we can now deal with it in a very different way, moving from government restrictions to personal responsibility. So we protect ourselves without losing our liberties and maintaining our contingent capabilities so we can respond rapidly to any new variant. Mr. Speaker, the UK was the first country in the world to administer an approved vaccine and the first European nation to protect half our population with at least one dose. And having made that decision to refocus our NHS this winter on the campaign to get boosted now, we were the first major European nation to boost half our population too. And it's because of the extraordinary success of this vaccination programme that we've been able to lift our restrictions earlier than other comparable countries, opening up last summer while others remained closed and keeping things open this winter while others shut down again, making us one of the most open economies and societies in Europe, with the fastest growth anywhere in the G7 last year. And while the pandemic is not over, we have now passed the peak of the Omicron wave, with cases falling, hospitalisations in England now fewer than 10,000 and still falling, and the link between infection and severe disease substantially weakened. Over 71% of all adults are now boosted in England, including 93% of those aged 70 and over. And together with the treatments and scientific understanding of the virus that we've built up, we now have sufficient levels of immunity to complete the transition from protecting people with government interventions to relying on vaccines and treatments as our first line of defence. As we have throughout the past 2 years, we will continue to work closely with the devolved administrations as they decide how to take forward their own plans. And today's strategy shows how we will structure our approach in England around 4 principles. First, we will remove all remaining domestic restrictions in law. From this Thursday, 24th of February, we will end the legal requirement to self-isolate following a positive test. And so we will also end self-isolation support payments, although COVID provisions for statutory sick pay can still be claimed for a further month. We will end routine contact tracing and no longer ask fully vaccinated close contacts and those under 18 to test daily for 7 days. and we will remove the legal requirement for close contacts who are not fully vaccinated to self-isolate. Until the 1st of April, we will still advise people who test positive to stay at home, but after that, we will encourage people with COVID-19 symptoms to exercise personal responsibility, just as we encourage people who may have flu to be considerate to others. Mr. Speaker, it's only because levels of immunity are so high and deaths are now, if anything, below where you would normally expect for this time of year, that we can lift these restrictions. And it's only because we know Omicron is less severe that testing for Omicron, on the colossal scale we've been doing, is much less important and much less valuable in preventing serious illness. We should be proud that the UK has established the biggest testing programme per person of any large country in the world. This came at vast cost. The test, trace and isolation budget in 2020-2021 exceeded the entire budget of the Home Office. It cost a further £15.7 billion in this financial year and £2 billion in January alone at the height of the Omicron wave. We must now scale this back. From today, we're removing the guidance for staff and students in most education and childcare settings to undertake twice-weekly asymptomatic testing. And from the 1st of April, when winter is over and the virus will spread less easily, we will end free symptomatic and asymptomatic testing for the general public. We will continue to provide free symptomatic tests to the oldest age groups and those most vulnerable to COVID. And in line with the practice in many other countries, we're working with retailers to ensure that everyone who wants to can buy a test. From April the 1st, we will also no longer recommend the use of voluntary COVID status certification, although the NHS app will continue to allow people to indicate their vaccination status for international travel. Mr. Speaker, the government will also expire all temporary provisions of the Coronavirus Act. Of the original 40, 20 have already expired and 16 will expire on the 24th of March. And the last 4, relating to innovations in public service, will expire 6 months later after we have made those improvements permanent via other means. Second, we will continue to protect the most vulnerable with targeted vaccines and treatments. The UK government has procured enough doses of vaccine to anticipate a wide range of possible JCVI recommendations. And today, we're taking further action to guard against a possible resurgence of the virus, accepting JCVI advice for a new spring booster offered to those aged 75 and older, to older care home residents, and those over 12 who are immunosuppressed. The UK is also leading the way on antivirals and therapeutics, with our antivirals task force securing a supply of almost 5 million, more per head than any other country in Europe. Third, SAGE advised there is considerable uncertainty about the future path of the pandemic, and there may, of course, be significant resurgences. They are certain there will be new variants, and it is very possible they will be worse than Omicron. So we will maintain our resilience to manage and respond to these risks, including our world-leading ONS survey, which will allow us to continue tracking the virus in granular detail, with regional and age breakdowns helping us to spot surges as and where they happen, and our laboratory networks will help us understand the evolution of the virus and identify any changes in characteristics. We will prepare and maintain our capabilities to ramp up testing. We will continue to support other countries in developing their own surveillance capabilities, because a new variant can emerge anywhere. And we will meet our commitment to donate 100 million vaccine doses by June as part of our agreement at the UK's G7 summit to provide 1 billion doses to vaccinate the world over the next year. In all circumstances, our aim will be to manage and respond to future risks through more routine public health interventions, with pharmaceutical interventions as the first line of defence. Fourth, we will build on the innovation that has defined the best of our response to the pandemic. The Vaccines Task Force will continue to ensure that the UK has access to effective vaccines as they become available, already securing contracts with manufacturers trialling bivalent vaccines which would provide protection against COVID variants. The Therapeutics Task Force will continue to support 7 national priority clinical trial platforms focused on prevention, novel treatments and treatments for long COVID. We are refreshing our biosecurity strategy to protect the UK against natural zoonosis and accidental laboratory leaks, as well as the potential for biological threats emanating from state and non-state actors. And building on the 5-point plan I set out at the UN and the agreements reached at the UK's G7 last year, we are working with our international partners on future pandemic preparedness, including through a new pandemic treaty, an effective early warning system or global pandemic radar, and a mission to make safe and effective diagnostics, therapeutics and vaccines available within the first 100 days of a future pandemic threat being identified. And we will be hosting a global pandemic preparedness summit next month. Mr. Speaker, COVID will not suddenly disappear. So those who would wait for a total end to this war before lifting the remaining regulations would be restricting the liberties of the British people for a long time to come. This government does not believe that that is right or necessary. Restrictions pose a heavy toll on our economy, our society, our mental well-being and on the life chances of our children. And we do not need to pay that cost any longer. We have a population that is protected by the biggest vaccination programme in our history. We have the antivirals, the treatments, and the scientific understanding of this virus. And we have the capabilities to respond rapidly to any resurgence or new variant. And, Mr. Speaker, it is time that we got our confidence back. We don't need laws to compel people to be considerate to others. We can rely on that sense of responsibility towards one another, providing practical advice in the knowledge that people will follow it to avoid infecting loved ones and others. So let us learn to live with this virus and continue protecting ourselves and others without restricting our freedoms. And in that spirit, Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
Can I just... Mr. Sherman, please. Can I just say, I understand the statement was important and the Prime Minister did run over, so I'm more than happy for the opposition leaders to also run over. Keir Starmer.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by sending my condolences to the family of Christopher Stallford? Christopher was a dedicated servant of the people of South Belfast, and his loss will be deeply felt. I'd also like to send our best wishes to Her Majesty the Queen, and as the Prime Minister said, the whole House wishes her a speedy recovery. Yeah. Can I thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of his statement and for the briefing earlier this afternoon. Mr. Speaker, huge efforts have been made over the last 2 years, and we would not be where we are today without the heroism of our NHS and key workers, those who pioneered and rolled out the vaccines, and the sacrifices that people made every day to follow the rules and protect our public health. We must honour the collective sacrifices of the British people and do everything possible to prevent a return to the loss and lockdowns we've seen over the last 2 years. The Prime Minister promised to present a plan for living with COVID. But all we've got today is yet more chaos and disarray. Not enough to prepare us for the new variants which may yet develop, an approach which seems to think that living with COVID means simply ignoring it. This morning, he couldn't even persuade his own health secretary to agree the plan. So what confidence can the public have that this is the right approach? Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. The Labour Party does not want to see restrictions in place for a moment longer than necessary. But, Mr. Speaker, we have to take the public with us, and that requires clarity.
Order. If you can't show the respect that I expect the Prime Minister to be heard inside, I expect the Leader of the Opposition. If you don't wish to be in here, there's plenty of room outside this chamber. I suggest you start using it, and I'll be helping you on your way. So let's have silence. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, we have to take the public with us, and that requires clarity about why decisions are being made. So will the Prime Minister publish the scientific evidence behind his decision to remove the legal requirement to self-isolate, including the impact on the clinically extremely vulnerable, for whom lockdown has never ended? Having come this far, I know the British people will continue to act responsibly, and they will do the right thing, testing and then isolating if positive. What I can't understand is why the Prime Minister is taking away the tools that will help them to do that. Free tests can't continue forever, but if you're 2-1 up with 10 minutes to go, you don't sub off one of your best defenders. The Prime Minister is also removing self-isolation support payments that allow many people to isolate and weakening sick pay. These are decisions which will hit the lowest paid and the most insecure workers the hardest, including care workers who got us through the toughest parts of the pandemic. It's all very well advising workers to self-isolate, but that won't work unless all workers have the security of knowing that they can afford to do so. The Prime Minister mentioned surveillance and the ONS infection survey. This is crucial to ensuring that we can ramp up testing and vaccination if the virus returns. So can the Prime Minister confirm that he has put the funding in place to ensure that the ONS infection survey will not see reduced capacity and that it will be able to track the virus with the same degree of detail as it can today? We can't turn off Britain's radar before the war is won. Ignorance is bliss is not a responsible approach to a deadly virus. It actually risks undoing all the hard-won progress the British people have achieved over the last 2 years. Mr. Speaker, the Labour Party has published a comprehensive plan for living well with COVID. Our plan would see us learn the lessons of the past 2 years and prepared for new variants. His approach will leave us vulnerable. Where's the plan to secure the UK's supply of testing? Why are schools still not properly ventilated? As a nation, there is no doubt we need to move on from COVID. People need to know their liberties are returning and returning for good. But this is a half-baked announcement from a government paralysed by chaos and incompetence. It is not a plan to live well with COVID. Thank you.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I really thought this was going to be the moment when he would end his run of making the wrong call on every single one of the big decisions. But, Mr. Speaker, time and time again, he's had the chance to back the government on the big decisions, and I'm afraid that he's got it wrong. And just to turn to some of the points that he's made, the evidence for what we're doing today is amply there in the scientific evidence, in the figures for the rates of infections that I've outlined today, and in all the data that is freely available to members of the House. And they can see what's happening with infection rates, with mortality, with what Omicron is doing across the country, Mr. Speaker. He asks about the clinically extremely vulnerable, and that's, of course, an entirely reasonable question. But what we are going to do is make sure that they continue to be protected with priority access to therapeutics and, of course, to vaccines as well. He asks about testing, Mr. Speaker, which is absolutely satirical, because week after week, month after month, I've listened to the Labour Party, Mr. Speaker, complaining about NHS testing, denouncing the cost denouncing the cost. Did you not hear them, Mr. Speaker? Denouncing the cost of NHS test and trace. And now they want to continue with it when, Mr. Speaker, we do not need to go on with it in the way that we are currently doing. So he asks about our ability to do tests or our domestic ability to manufacture tests. It's as though he doesn't know, Mr. Speaker, that we have in this country now one of the biggest manufacturers of lateral flow tests in Europe. Mr. Speaker, this is a leader of the opposition who, as I say, has shown an absolutely ferocious grip of the wrong end of the stick. He never ceases to amaze. He was wrong on July the 19th. If you remember, totally wrong. He said we shouldn't open up on July the 19th. He said that the Labour Party, there he has said that we needed a roadmap back into lockdown, Mr. Speaker, during December. They wanted to stay. He voted several times. They wanted to stay in the European Medicines Agency, and contrary to his denials in this House, Mr. Speaker, he voted several times to do so. He's been consistently wrong on all the big calls. He was wrong then, he's wrong now. What we are doing, Mr. Speaker, is moving forward in a balanced, sensible and proportionate way. Moving forward away from legal compulsion in a way that I think the British people understand, and trusting in them and trusting in their great sense of personal responsibility.
Chair of the Select Committee, Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I support today's announcement, which is a tribute to British science and to the government's leadership in the vaccine programme. Does the Prime Minister agree, when it comes to future pandemics, that the real danger zone are those early months when we don't have a vaccine against a new virus? And in that context, it's not just whether the NHS can cope, but whether the NHS can cope without switching off other vital life-saving treatments. And if he agrees with that, that it is not just enough to say that we have more doctors and nurses than we had before, but that we also need to make sure we have enough doctors for the future. And if he has plans for that, would he please tell the House how he will make sure that we are actually training enough?
I thank my right honourable friend very much. And he's returning to a theme. He's returning to a theme that he's mentioned several times. We have a vast plan, Mr. Speaker, to recruit more nurses and more doctors than ever before. There already are more in the NHS than at any time in our history. We have 45,000 more now this year healthcare professionals than there were last year, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to fund them.
Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This statement was billed as a Prime Minister's moment of pride. But it's clear that this morning has been a moment of panic for this government. Disagreement across Whitehall and a lack of any serious engagement with the devolved nations shows that these decisions are bereft of science or consultation. It appears these dangerous choices are purely political and have been made up on the hoof. It is another symptom of a government in turmoil. The illogical reality of UK finance means that these decisions, made for England by a failing Prime Minister, affect the money the devolved nations have to provide testing. It is unacceptable that the ability to protect money, I hear money. We're talking about protecting the people of Scotland, something that this Prime Minister is turning his back on. And it's unacceptable that the ability to protect our population can be imperilled on the basis of a political decision taken by a Prime Minister in crisis. His decisions directly affect whether Scotland has the funding required to keep its people safe. That is the ridiculous reality of devolution, but it's a reality that must be addressed. So will the Prime Minister now confirm what the residual funding for testing will be to enable the Scottish Government to pick up the pieces of this chaotic withdrawal of support? Mr. Speaker, it makes the case for Scotland to take necessary measures to keep our people safe. We need the financial ability to make our own choices. That, Mr. Speaker, only comes with independence. Mr. Speaker,
I will also hear the Leader of the Opposition in silence. I don't need the Burger King. He certainly doesn't need it. I don't need it in Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. PCR testing, the legal requirement to self-isolate and access to lateral flow testing have been instrumental, Prime Minister, in containing the virus. As we move forward to live with COVID, these are the very safeguards which support a return to normal life. And these short-sighted decisions have long-term implications. They also hamper vital surveillance efforts and impede the ability to respond to new variants. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that we have a Prime Minister beset by chaos and mired in a police investigation for breaking his own COVID laws, and he can shake his head, but that's the reality, Mr. Speaker. A Prime Minister who has no moral authority to lead, desperately seeking to appease his backbenchers. We know this reckless statement flies in the face of advice from scientists at the World Health Organization. That's because this statement is not about protecting the public. It's about the Prime Minister scrambling to save his own skin.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you wouldn't believe it from what the Right Honourable Gentleman has just said, but the cooperation between the UK Government, the Scottish Authority, has been outstanding and will continue to be outstanding. And I can tell him. He asked about free tests and how they're to be paid for. It's very important. The free tests will, of course, continue until the beginning of April. And of course, if people want to continue beyond then, and I've set out for the House the reasons why we think it's much more sensible to focus, Mr. Speaker, on surveillance and spotting new variants, put our investment into that rather than mass testing. Then he has, Mr. Speaker, access to the 41 billion record settlement that he has under Barnett, and he also, Mr. Speaker, has access to hundreds of millions from the health and care levy. The only astonishing thing is that he voted against it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I warmly welcome the statement that the Prime Minister has made. The Prime Minister will also be aware of growing international evidence that lockdowns have been largely ineffective in preventing COVID mortality. And we're acutely aware of the massive damage which has been done economically and to non-COVID health of the people due to lockdowns. Will he review pandemic planning for the future to make sure these crucial lessons are learned?
Yes, I thank my right honourable friend, and he's right to draw attention to all sorts of studies about the efficacy of lockdowns. We'll look at all the evidence. I happen to think that the collective actions of the British public were indispensable in saving many thousands of lives, Mr. Speaker, but I'm sure that all the evidence will be looked at in the course of the inquiry.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. New antiviral drugs have made a huge difference to the treatment of COVID. They are indeed, as the Prime Minister says, the first line of defence, but they work best when given early. Now, one of the requirements at the moment in order to qualify to get an antiviral drug is that the person has tested positive for COVID. If the Prime Minister is going to get rid of free lateral flow tests, how are people going to get access to those medicines?
Mr. Speaker, obviously, great respect to the right honourable people who are symptomatic will, of course, continue to have access to testing.
Well, it's a birthday person, Sarah Bretliff.
Programme is the reason that we're in this position today, and I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody involved in Highburn and Haslingden for the rollout of the vaccination programme and those who have had to deal with the restrictions for longer than most. But does the Prime Minister agree with me that this is exactly why we must learn to live with the virus due to how damaging restrictions can be on mental health and well-being?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. And we have to set all these decisions, the cost of lockdowns, the cost of on people's mental health and well-being, against the difficult decisions that we have to make about opening up our society. And I think the House understands that. I think this is a balanced decision that is entirely right. I should just clarify to the right honourable gentleman that, of course, those who are vulnerable, who are symptomatic, will, of course, continue to have access to testing. And I should have said that in my answer to his question.
Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a recent survey, the majority of NHS leaders agree it was not the right time to end free testing for the public. Can the Prime Minister tell me why he disagrees with those NHS leaders and what scientific advice he has considered to come to this decision, which could have a real impact on the NHS elective recovery plan?
I hear the anxieties of people, but I have to say that I think that this is the balanced and the right decision. Testing, and I just remind her of what her benches have previously said about the cost of testing. We now think that the best thing to focus on is, given the severity of Omicron, the best thing is to focus on surveillance and to use the huge funds that we're currently dedicating to mass testing on electives and all the other things that we need to do.
Clark.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker. Sir Andrew Pollard of the Oxford Vaccine Group said this morning that it doesn't make a big difference whether the decision to lift these restrictions is taken now or in a few weeks' time. So it's not clear what the purpose of waiting any longer would be. But one of the things that we do know in the past is at times we didn't have the testing capacity that we needed at times when we needed it most acutely. So given the ongoing surveillance, if that were to throw up a variant that was more dangerous than Omicron, how quickly can we stand up and deploy again mass testing?
I thank him, and that's exactly the right question, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we're putting so much emphasis on surveillance, on the ONS, with its amazing granular ability to detect what is going on in local areas, as well as other forms of surveillance. We want to spot the new variant of concern as soon as we can, Mr. Speaker, and then we want to surge our testing capacity in the way that we did before, and of course much faster now, since it is all ready to go. We will have stockpiles, Mr. Speaker. We will keep our labs in readiness, and we will be able to surge where necessary. But now is not the right time to continue with mass testing. Or from April, it will not be the right time to continue with mass testing in the way that we have.
David.
Can I join the Prime Minister in sending our very best wishes to Her Majesty the Queen and hope she gets well soon? Mr. Speaker, there are millions of family carers across our country taking regular lateral flow tests to ensure they don't pass COVID on to their vulnerable loved ones. The Prime Minister now says these family carers must pay for COVID tests out of their own pocket, even though so many family carers can hardly make ends meet at the moment. Is the Prime Minister really telling people they must choose between money for the weekly shop or a test so they don't accidentally take this contagious virus into their loved ones' homes? Surely such a tax on caring would be unfair and unjust.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right to draw attention to the need to honourable gentleman's right to draw attention to the need to protect care homes and those who work in care homes. He should wait until March, when we'll be setting out in more detail those who will continue to be entitled to free tests.
The man for the rules, Matt Hancock.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, almost 2 years ago now, this House voted unanimously on the statutory measures necessary to keep people safe during the pandemic. And I agree with the Prime Minister that now, thanks to the vaccines, these measures are no longer necessary, and indeed that we're the first major country in the world to be past the pandemic. Yeah. But isn't it extraordinary that despite that consensus on restrictions back then, the consensus on giving people back their freedom, which is often so much harder, and trusting to personal responsibility, that consensus appears only to exist on this side of the House?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and I think it's a great shame that the opposition cannot find it in themselves to support what I think is a balanced and proportionate approach, and one, Mr. Speaker, that recognises that COVID has not gone away and that we cannot throw caution to the winds.
Rod Shaw.
Mr. Speaker. Given everything else the Prime Minister said this afternoon, why is he keeping the bureaucratic and irritating passenger locator form?
Right. Well, a welcome call for liberty from the opposition benches, but I can tell him that we already have one of the most open travel systems in the world, and the passenger locator form, I understand his grievance against it. We are certainly reviewing it by Easter.
Sir John Redwood.
Great news that our freedoms are being restored. So can the Prime Minister now bring that same focus and government innovation shown on this topic to vanquish the cost of living crisis so that more people have enough money to enjoy the freedoms?
Yes. You bet, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We do not know how well the vaccine works on immunocompromised people, and they and their loved ones will rightly be extremely worried. And as the Honourable Member for Leeds Central raised, there are delays in getting test results, thus delaying access to life-saving antivirals. Can we allow them to have a supply of antivirals at home? Because if his pharmaceutical interventions would save lives, let's make sure that they can access them ASAP.
Mr. Speaker, we've already secured more antivirals and therapeutics per head than any other country in Europe. What we need to do is ensure that those who are clinically extremely vulnerable do have access to them, and 1.3 million of them have already been sent tests.
Parliament Macron.
Mr. Speaker, whilst the threat from COVID has changed, thanks in no small part to the outstanding vaccination efforts led by my honourable friend, the Prime Minister, he will know that the effects on local hospitals will last for years to come. Does he agree with me that now is the right time to invest in upgrades to hospitals like Scunthorpe?
Now is exactly the right time, Mr. Speaker, to invest in hospitals like Scunthorpe across the country. I cannot give a commitment to the particular project that she described, but it is the kind of project, Mr. Speaker, 48 of which, as you know, Mr. Speaker, we are progressing across the country.
First of all, can I welcome the fact that we are having these restrictions lifted, and I hope that the Prime Minister will engage with the Health Minister in Northern Ireland to make sure that the same measures are exercised in Northern Ireland. The Prime Minister has said, though, that it is important that we get our confidence back. We have lived through 2 years of fear being instilled in the population. Can he tell us what nudge tactics he now intends to engage in to ensure that that confidence is restored so that people can get back to work, back into the shops and restaurants, and back doing the things which make life enjoyable?
Parties. Perhaps I could begin, Mr. Speaker, by echoing the condolences for the DUP MLA, Christopher Salford. And Mr. Speaker, I agree wholly with his sentiments. We do need people to get their confidence back, and as I said the other day, what I think people can do, they can set an example. They can go to work, Mr. Speaker. I think going to work is that. Well, you wait and see. Going to work, Mr. Speaker.
David Davis.
Cheer up the Prime Minister by welcoming what he has to say today. And say to him that the comment of the Leader of the Opposition that the government had no plan to deal with this was destroyed by his own right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, who pointed out that antiviral therapeutics were incredibly effective, 95% effective against this disease. And am I right, can the Prime Minister confirm that we have 2.75 million courses of such therapeutics available to us already?
No, Mr. Speaker, I can't confirm that. What I can tell him, in fact, we have twice the amount. We have 4.9 million doses.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Living with COVID does not mean ignoring it, and he will be aware that lifting of restrictions today flies in the face of advice from many NHS leaders and health experts, including the BMA and the World Health Organization. And saying everyone should take personal responsibility, while at the very same time taking away the very means that would allow them to take that personal responsibility, is utterly perverse. So what would he say to those of my constituents, particularly those who are clinically extremely vulnerable, for whom his Freedom Day is a day of profound fear and loss of freedom? And would he clarify his response to the Right Honourable Member for Kingston and Surbiton? Because it's not just an issue of free testing for people in care homes, it's a question of free testing at the very least for the almost 7 million carers up and down this country.
So just on that, Mr. Speaker, she should wait, as I said to her right honourable friend from Kingston and Surbiton. And on the clinically extremely vulnerable, I think it's very important to remember that they do have, and we will continue as we have throughout the pandemic, to look after them with all the therapeutics that we can, with vaccines where that's appropriate. As you know, the House knows the shielding programme ended in September. But I think what people need to recognise with the CEV, with the clinically extremely vulnerable, is that we should treat them with caution, just as anybody with any respiratory disease should treat the clinically extremely vulnerable with caution, respect them and act with responsibility.
Edward Timpson.
Mr. Speaker, and I fully endorse the Prime Minister's statement. It's a significant step forward. But whilst also wanting to get more confidence back into the country, people also want some consistency so they can plan ahead. And to that end, will he look at what we do with schools and education more generally, particularly around making them an essential part of our national infrastructure, so that in any future occasions where we may be considering restrictions across the country, schools, nurseries, colleges and universities are at the very back of that queue, so that we make sure that that lost learning we saw during this pandemic doesn't happen again?
My honourable friend makes an excellent point, and that's why we're ensuring that schools are able to be as COVID secure as possible, sending out 350,000 CO2 monitors, 9,000 air cleaning units, amongst other steps that we're taking to protect schools. And I think it's very, very important that we should get the message over to everybody that schools are safe, and not one of the many things, Mr. Speaker, that the Leader of the Opposition got wrong.
Alex Davis-Jones.
The Prime Minister, in outlining his reckless plan for living with COVID, announced that he is relying on the British public to apply personal responsibility when it comes to the virus. Does this also apply to the Prime Minister?
She says it's a reckless plan, Mr. Speaker. That was exactly the word that the Right Honourable Gentleman Leader of the Opposition used to describe the July 19th openings. I wonder whether she still believes that.
Al Carper.
Mr. Speaker, I'll take the Prime Minister's statement, if I may, as his application to join the COVID recovery group. He's very welcome indeed. I only wish it had been sooner. Can I ask him a question, though? On all of the lockdowns and the serious restrictions have all been implemented using the Public Health Act, some of them by ministerial decree, only approved by Parliament retrospectively. If we're to believe that next time will be different, why doesn't this plan include proposals to change the Public Health Act to make ministers more accountable to Parliament now, rather than kicking it into the long grass, waiting for the results of the COVID public inquiry?
Well, I know that my right honourable friend is a staunch Thatcherite, and he will recall it was Margaret Thatcher who actually promulgated the Public Health Act in 1984. It has served this country well for a long time. I'll consider the point that he makes. It is a valuable one, but I think it may also be something that the inquiry will want to consider themselves.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With 38,000 new COVID cases today, can the Prime Minister explain which public health experts advised abandoning testing and isolation, and when will that advice be published?
Yes, I thank her very much. And as you know, cases are falling, hospitalisations. hospitalisations are falling, and the number of excess deaths from Omicron is actually in negative territory, and we consult a wide range of scientific opinion, including SAGE and clearly CSA and CMO, but the decisions are for ministers, and we take them.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now then, unlike the opposition, the Prime Minister has got all the big decisions right through the pandemic. But will he agree with me that we should never return to a full lockdown, and any isolation should be targeted? It should be the clinically vulnerable, the elderly and the Labour front bench.
Not
in that order.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend has put it brilliantly and succinctly, and I have nothing to add.
Chris Bryan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Liberty is always better than the alternative. As long as everybody can share in that liberty equally. So the anxiety for some of us, especially those who represent very poor communities, is that if you are symptomatic and free testing is ended, you may end up having to pay £59, £119 for a PCR test. And then on top of that, if you do the responsible thing and stay away from work, you may be in a job where you're not going to get any money at all, or you're going to get pathetic sick pay. Don't we have to make sure, if we are going to make sure that everybody shares in that liberty equally, that the poorest in Britain get a better deal?
The right honourable gentleman makes a very important point, but I think that overwhelmingly, first of all, there will be statutory sick pay available, but secondly, I think if I may say so, I think he underestimates people's sense of responsibility, and also people's willingness to do the right thing by others.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome what the Prime Minister has set out today, and I especially welcome his commitment to Scunny Hospital. And I also welcome his continuation of the ONS survey study, not least because my mum and dad have been taking part in it, and it's given them something to do throughout the course of COVID, rather than text me constantly. But can I, on NHS testing, as somebody who knows works in the NHS myself, I like getting my test before I book on duty. It makes me feel safe when I'm going into care homes to attend patients or elsewhere. So as he sets out how testing will continue in March, can he set out clearly what the situation will be for testing of NHS workers?
Can I first of all thank my honourable friend very much for his service in the NHS and throughout the pandemic, and I've seen him in action, but also to say that on his point about the NHS, that will be for the NHS to determine themselves.
Florence Session-Lurby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister mentioned this afternoon it's about personal responsibility, and it is. It's about our personal responsibility not to inadvertently pass on that virus to someone who's vulnerable. It's about our personal responsibility to do the right thing if we have the symptoms and if we have COVID. It's about our personal responsibility to think about our neighbours, our friends, our carers, the people who need those restrictions lifted. What does the Prime Minister have to say to my vulnerable constituents in Vauxhall who are concerned that this personal responsibility that the Prime Minister wants us to take may inadvertently lead to them catching COVID?
Prime Minister.
I thank her very much, and she's right to focus on personal responsibility, but the other part of the strategy is the vaccinations, and this is a vaccine-led strategy, and that's what enables us and that's what enables us now to rely on people's personal responsibility as well.
Manchester.
Mr. Speaker, can I very much welcome the statement by the Prime Minister and the way he set out the argument with regards to living with COVID in respecting and restoring people's freedoms and at the same time with regards to protecting public health. The key advance that we have for future, Prime Minister, is that we have the mapping exercise with vaccination centres already in place, such as in Medway. With that being the case, will the Prime Minister also thank the excellent volunteers and the NHS staff in Medway and look at their bid for a new Medway hospital in my constituency for the future?
No, Mr. Speaker, I better be careful what I say about more hospitals. We want to build as many hospitals as we possibly can, but we'll have to look at his plan. I do want to thank the Medway volunteers. I want to thank everybody still involved in the vaccination campaign. There are still millions of people, Mr. Speaker, who have not yet had their booster, and I urge them to get it.
Catherine West.
Lovely to have the Prime Minister with us today, not filling in his questionnaires or having his busy meetings with the police.
Will he confirm or deny the reports that there is a sell-off plan to the Vaccine Manufacturing and Innovation Centre, which has been founded on the values and the mission of people like Dr. Sarah Gilbert, who invented the AstraZeneca vaccination? There are rumours going about that this public-private enterprise will be sold off to the private sector. Will he confirm or deny what is the government's intention? Because the essence of the reason that we were ahead with the vaccine was the excellence and the values of those wonderful British scientists who worked their socks off to get this. Don't just sell it off.
Mr. Speaker, I might also add that one of the most important factors in the success of the vaccine rollout was the private sector, and it was private sector investment, Mr. Speaker, that led to the AstraZeneca vaccine, the Pfizer vaccines, and we will make sure that we work with the private sector to continue to develop this country's native indigenous ability to manufacture mRNA and other types of vaccines.
Bailey.
Speaker, keeping healthy people at home in isolation has had a devastating impact on lives, businesses and important life events like weddings. So I welcome these changes to trust the British people and to allow people to plan with confidence. Yet we all have constituents who are immune compromised and they're vulnerable, like the woman who wrote to me this morning. Unlike what the opposition budget say, they do not have a monopoly on compassion. We care about these people. Will my right honourable friend just reassure again that these people will get the support they need and that the timing is right and there's no point in waiting for these changes?
Yes, she's absolutely right, Mr. Speaker, and we'll make sure that those people get not just the antivirals that they need, but also the tests that they need.
Karen Smith.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I think that's the point I would really like clarification from the Prime Minister, because I think we've learnt today that the 7 million carers won't get tests. NHS staff and care staff would have to be found within existing budgets, thus making those waiting lists even more precarious. But eligibility for antivirals is based on being over 12, being at high risk, having symptoms or testing positive for COVID-19, for which people will have to pay. Can the Prime Minister confirm that that is the case? And I see the Health Secretary is helping him out, but if you could clarify that for people, that would be really helpful.
Mr. Speaker, she will, if she waits a little bit longer, she will get a breakdown of how we propose to support the most vulnerable, but we will support them, Mr. Speaker, as we have done throughout the pandemic.
Rebecca Lee.
Experts will argue for years whether we made the right choices, and some of us, for what it's worth, would have liked a lighter touch. But one thing is certain, and we know this from independent testimony which has emerged from a former advisor of the Prime Minister, that but for his freedom-loving instincts and libertarian instincts, these lockdowns would have been much longer and much worse, with incalculable consequences for the young and people's mental health. So can we rely on the Prime Minister in the future to rule out any more lockdowns in the coming decade while he remains Prime Minister?
What you can certainly rely on, Mr. Speaker, is that this government will take the tough decisions to protect the British people, and we will have a vaccine and science-led approach to dealing with this pandemic.
Simon Mulhotter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has come to the House today unable to state whether carers in our communities, visiting home after home in one day, often of older people and those who are clinically extremely vulnerable, will still have access to free tests in order to keep themselves and their patients and clients safe. He has now said that testing for NHS staff will be a matter for the NHS. Surely he can do better than this. Even the NHS and carers need to be able to plan ahead for what is coming. Won't he come clean with the House today about his intentions?
Mr. Speaker, what we're doing is moving away from systematic mass testing of large numbers of people, which is no longer the right way to deal with Omicron, to a surveillance-led approach. And of course, we will continue to look after the most vulnerable and those who need it, Mr. Speaker.
Peg Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the path to freedom the Prime Minister has set out? And I am sure that as the Leader of the Opposition, the Welsh First Minister will condemn the plan today, but in about 2 weeks present the same plan as his own. So my Prime Minister to reach out to the Labour First Minister and the other devolved administrations who we have worked well with when ugly nationalism is put aside, to get those freedoms for the residents of Montgomeryshire as quickly as possible.
I thank my honourable friend, and I indeed, as I extend the hand of cooperation to our Scottish friends of the Scottish administration, I hope that the Welsh administration in Cardiff will see the way forward. And as I've said many times before, the similarities in our approach greatly outweigh the differences.
Clive Afford.
It's hard to imagine that this is the Prime Minister that missed five COBRA meetings at the start of this pandemic. My constituent, who spoke to me yesterday, who's immunosuppressed, anticipated the difficulties that the Prime Minister is having over testing for people who are clinically vulnerable. She wanted to know whether she was going to have ready access to free tests and whether she was going to get ready access to antivirals should she test positive. Exactly. And what is the situation that those people are being plunged in today?
I thank you very much. The answer to those questions is yes and yes. So for the 1.3 CEV, 1.3 million clinically extremely vulnerable, they will of course be given access to testing, free testing, Mr. Speaker, and they will also have access to the largest quantity of antivirals and therapeutics per head of any European population.
Alberto Costa.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With a world-leading successful vaccination programme, with the fastest growth rate in the G7, and in my South Leicestershire constituency, some of the highest employment that we've seen in generations, does this not demonstrate that during this COVID pandemic, when it comes to the big decisions, this Prime Minister and the government he leads has got them right?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I have to say, look, I'm casting modesty, if not caution, to the winds. Yes, we have got it right, Mr. Speaker, though there have been some very difficult decisions, and would have been nice today, finally, to have had the support of the opposition.
Rupa Huck.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you. I'm sure the whole House will join me in paying tribute to my constituent Jamal Edwards, a musical pioneer taken from us way too young yesterday. The Prime Minister justifies this crowd pleaser for his own MPs with warning us about damage to the economy. But can I ask him, when the ONS say that 1.3 million of our fellow citizens are suffering from the debilitating condition of long COVID, which actually has rendered 396,000 people economically inactive, it causes dysfunctionality, it ages people by 10 years. What is it that this Prime Minister is doing to advance research and treatment into this condition? And how does today's exercise help those people?
She's absolutely right, Madam Deputy Speaker, to mention the problem of long COVID. We've invested 224 million into expanding NHS treatment of long COVID, and we're putting another 50 million into research into that syndrome.
Henry Smith.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I very much welcome the Prime Minister's statement today, a return to liberty, so that we can further grow our economy, so that we can tackle those other health conditions. But can he say a little bit more about what targeted support will be provided for those who are immunosuppressed and immunocompromised, such as those with blood cancer?
And then monoclonal antibodies.
I thank him very much. So we've secured supplies of monoclonal antibodies, as I told the House, in record numbers. But what we'll also do is make sure that those who are immunosuppressed have access to testing to see whether they need the therapeutics.
Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The deep irony about this Prime Minister election as in personal responsibility won't be lost on the public watching at home. And to misquote Kevin Bridges, personal responsibility won't pay the bills. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, he called for a full nations approach, time and time again, bemoaning any deviation in approach in Cardiff, Belfast or Edinburgh. Now he is recklessly, dangerously dropping all restrictions in England ending community testing without consultation or consideration of devolved needs and flying in the face of the scientific advice he has been given. This just proves that his full nations approach is simply meant to follow Westminster's direction, no matter how rash, doesn't it?
First of all, Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, we're not dropping the testing until the beginning of April, as he knows, and it's only thanks it's only thanks to the massive financial firepower of the UK that we've been able to run the biggest testing. We've been able to run the biggest testing operation in Europe, plus the fastest vaccination rollout.
Michael Fabricant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I ask my right honourable friend to cast his mind back to January last year, when Chris Whitty said there will come a time when COVID will be the same as flu, where actually there are 7,000 to 20,000 deaths each year. At that time, there was no comment against him from either the Labour Party or the SNP. Now that we have excess deaths at minus 9% of what is normal at this time, is he as baffled as I am about the attitude that the Labour front bench now has?
Yes, actually, Mr. Speaker, I am. I thank you very much. I'm genuinely surprised by the approach that they've taken today. I do think it is wrong, but I think you're making an important point about the comparison with flu, because it is very important that people with any respiratory disease think about those who are clinically vulnerable and behave in a responsible and considerate way.
Chiomura.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A plan for living with COVID which does not provide for older and extremely vulnerable people, which does not include school children or sick pay for the working people or testing. Isn't it the case that this is a plan in the same sense, only in the same sense, that his birthday was not a party?
No, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a plan that addresses every single one of those priorities. Sick pay, schools, the vulnerable. This plan deals with all of them, and I think it's the right way forward. And I think actually she should support it.
David Evans.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I strongly welcome and endorse my right honourable friend's statement today, restoring our freedoms. Yeah. Would he agree that the restrictions, although necessary, have taken a very heavy toll on businesses and our society, and we have to live with the virus for the future? However, on this side, we passionately believe in trusting the people to take personal responsibility.
Beautifully put, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Are the 100 million doses of vaccine being donated as part of the global response counted towards or in addition to the government's 0.5% ODA target? And when will it stop blocking agreement on a TRIPS waiver so that developing countries can take vaccine response into their own hands?
Hear, hear.
He's raising a very important but very difficult issue. And in answer to the honourable lady opposite, I mentioned the importance of the private sector. We do need to ensure that the pharmaceutical companies have the wherewithal to make these colossal investments that offer hope for humanity.
Chris Clarkson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to start by congratulating my right honourable friend for his forbearance, because across that dispatch box, first he was faced by the vacillations of general indecision, and then by the rank opportunism of Captain Hindsight. So does my right honourable friend agree with me, if he'd listened to Lieutenant Lockdown there, instead of having the first major economy to unlock and a world-leading vaccine programme, we'd now be facing a major catastrophe?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and the most important thing, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that we would not, if we'd taken those steps, if we'd remained in lockdown, we would not have the financial wherewithal, the firepower, the money to pay for all the things that the people now need support with. Not least, Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, clearing the COVID backlogs.
Grant Davis.
Thank you. The Prime Minister says that this is a scientific decision,
So can you remind the House what the current R rate is, the reinfection rate, what it's projected to be by the start of May, and at what level of R rate is he willing to reintroduce testing and self-isolation? Or isn't it a scientific decision?
As I've said earlier on, Madam Deputy Speaker, the rate of infections is falling, and so are hospitalisations.
Teresa Villiers.
Aspects of the pandemic has been that many people have been unable to visit their sick or even dying relatives in hospital. And visiting has still been very difficult, even with the improvement in the COVID situation. Well, will the Prime Minister make sure this day is when NHS visiting requirements in our hospital go back to normal? Because that is the humane and compassionate thing to do.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank my right friend very much. I know she speaks for millions of people around the country. I can tell her that many restrictions have already been lifted, and they will continue to be lifted.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. 3 years ago, the Government consulted on much-needed reforms to statutory sick pay, rightly recognising that the current system is inflexible and doesn't reflect modern working life. Those reforms were postponed when the pandemic hit, and instead day one access to statutory sick pay was introduced. I think he's just announced that day one access to statutory sick pay is going to be withdrawn in a month's time. Will he then now bring forward the much needed and long delayed reforms to statutory sick pay?
As the right honourable gentleman knows, that statutory sick pay is only a part of what many employees already receive as part of their sick pay.
Duncan Baker.
To remind people, the Prime Minister was right last July when we came out of lockdown with the sensible steps that we took. Also proved right that we were absolutely doing the right thing when we went against the grain of many other nations and ended up riding out the situation that we had at Christmas. So I entirely endorse what we're seeing today. There's been a number of good questions about the immunosuppressed. So could I ask a slightly different one, that rather than wait for assessments from a GP or a consultant, who are, after all, very busy and not working 24/7 all the time, that we consider a 24-hour immunosuppressed hotline for advice which would help these anxious people and give direct support as they learn to live with COVID.
Can I thank my honourable friend for that extremely interesting idea, and I know it's one that my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, may wish to discuss with him.
Justin Matters.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm not sure if the Prime Minister understands that supporting people to self-isolate isn't a restriction on their freedom. It's actually what a responsible government does. So he will know that millions of people don't qualify for SSP at the moment, and without financial support they will not be able to self-isolate. So can he understand the invidious position that he's actually putting some people in?
Madam Deputy Speaker, of course I understand the difficult position that some people may find themselves in, but I hope that everybody will also understand that it is our job to be responsible towards others and to avoid spreading the disease.
Jane Stevenson.
Deputy Speaker, one of the biggest tragedies of the pandemic has been the isolation and desperation of those living in care homes and of their families at home, many of whom joined groups like Rights for Residents. Can the Prime Minister assure them that they will now be able to visit their loved ones in care homes with the use of testing and other measures to keep them safe?
Yes, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Janet Davey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. When people attend our wonderful Lewisham Hospital A&E department for treatment and have a blood test, they are automatically tested for HIV unless they opt out. The oldest person to discover she was HIV was 75 years old. The reason I raise this to the Prime Minister is because many people still have weakened immunity and do not know this. Having COVID restrictions lifted further exposes people with a weakened immunity to the virus. Can the Prime Minister say how he intends to protect these people?
I thank her very much, and she's right to draw attention to the immunosuppressed and those who are particularly vulnerable. That's why they will continue to have access to free testing, plus the therapeutics that I've described.
Craig Whittaker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The British sequencing regime in this country is one of the best in the world, with over 13% of all tests sequenced here in this country. Now, on that basis, can my honourable friend say what steps are being taken to ensure that despite reductions in testing, that our sequencing capacity in this country will stay at one of the best in the world?
I can certainly assure my honourable friend that we will retain that capacity.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In order to have good surveillance, the Prime Minister will need data. In order to get that data, he will need that data from testing, particularly if it's looking at future variants of the virus. So can he explain where he's going to get that data from in order to trace the future mutations of COVID?
That's exactly what the ONS survey does.
Matt Warman.
Mr. Speaker, it is the vaccination programme led by this Prime Minister that got us to this position, and it is the vaccination programme that will keep us out of lockdown. But what we know as from the pandemic is that online misinformation about the vaccine costs lives. The Prime Minister took a very strong line on this early in the pandemic. As we continue to rely on vaccines, can he reassure me that we will not suffer online misinformation about vaccines, which will continue to save lives?
Yes, Madam Deputy Speaker, and one of the things the Online Harms Bill does is to try to tackle that kind of pernicious disinformation online.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Unless the Prime Minister publishes the full advice which says that this decision was science-led, it will confirm what we have long suspected, that he is prepared to sacrifice anything and anyone in order to save his own skin. He just claimed that he'd been working closely with the devolved governments on this issue. So why then are the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government saying that the first they'd heard of this plan was his throwaway line at PMQs just 10 days ago?
Here.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I would have thought 10 days was quite a lot of notice.
Hugh Merriman.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I agree with the Prime Minister. Now is the right time to make these changes. Can I therefore ask him how it can be justified that the passenger location form stays in place? Can I ask him to commit to end this form by Easter? It would give a much-needed shot in the arm to the travel industry.
I hear him loud and clear, and as I've heard several pleas on that matter today already, and repeat what I've said, we'll be looking into it before Easter.
Flora Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Case numbers of COVID are rising in Wandsworth, and people are really concerned about this plan. They've had to choose between heating and eating, and now they'll have to choose between heating, eating and testing. There have been a flurry of reports about a paralysed cabinet arguing over what to announce here at the 11th hour. The Prime Minister is asking us to have confidence in a plan that health leaders do not have confidence in. Can he assure the House today that the full Cabinet have confidence in this plan?
Yes, of course they do, Madam Deputy. Of course they do, and this plan is completely scientifically attested. It's the right thing to do.
Robert Jenrick.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for this very important statement today and the reassurance that he has provided in the statement to the clinically extremely vulnerable. The government took huge steps to support those individuals, like creating the shielding programme that delivered millions of food boxes to people's doors within a matter of weeks. And it's absolutely right that we continue to stand by and support them into the future with testing, with the antivirals, as he's already laid out today.
He's quite right in what he says about the plan, but Madam Deputy, can I thank him for his outstanding work when he was responsible for local government in helping to deliver those parcels and helping to support people in the way that he did.
Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sure the Prime Minister has taken or has consulted the Chief Medical Officer for England and the Chief Scientific Officer for England. But consulting them is not quite the same thing as taking their advice. So can the Prime Minister confirm for the House today, has he taken the advice of the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Officer when it comes to ending mandatory self-isolation periods and ending testing?
I've not only consulted their opinions, I've taken their advice, and if after this statement, Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope very much that he will be able to see a press conference involving both those gentlemen and questions that will no doubt be put to them as well.
Richard Drax.
To lead is a lonely place, and I've seen courage today, and I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for the statement that he's made. If he recalls, we weren't on the same side when it came to lockdown, and in that regard, can I gently suggest to my right honourable friend that were a pandemic to strike again, the government advises and counsels and doesn't curb our freedoms.
It's fair to say that I think everybody is going to want to learn all the lessons from this pandemic, Madam Deputy Speaker, and make sure that we take the best steps should a new variant strike us. But I have great confidence in vaccines.
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister is focused now on a vaccines strategy as our first line of defence. So will the Prime Minister assure me that he will take personal responsibility for areas like mine that only have a booster rate of 39% to ensure continued vaccination in our community so that my constituents aren't left behind in this rush to freedom?
Yes, she makes a very good point, and I will do anything I can to help her. The national average for adults for boosters is about 71% now, so that is low, and we will do what we can to help.
Jerome Mayhew.
The data has now proven that Labour and the naysayers were wrong about Omicron. How important was that decision not to lock down at Christmas, building resilience in our communities but also in our economy, in the ability today to lift restrictions?
I thank my honourable. I think that look, we have to be humble in the face of this disease, Madam Deputy Speaker. It remains a dangerous disease. We must continue to be cautious, but we also have to take balanced decisions that are right for the country. And I think it is clear now that both the July the 19th decision and the decision over Christmas and a New Year were correct.
Stephen Flynn.
Madam Deputy Speaker, is it not the case that the decision being taken here today has nothing to do with protecting public health, but everything to do with protecting this Prime Minister from his own backbenchers?
No, he's completely wrong.
Nick Fletcher.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The businesses in the market town of Thorn in my constituency are failing to benefit from the UK's fantastic growth due to the main car park being used by a COVID testing facility. With today's announcement, can the PM confirm that these facilities will now be vastly reduced or removed so that towns like Thorn can get back to their bustling pre-pandemic norm?
Yes, I know exactly what he's talking about. I'm sure he speaks for many, and that facility, and it's done fantastic work, but it will be decommissioned shortly.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for the COVID-19 vaccination programmes that all of the citizens of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland have benefited from. Whilst I am in agreement that we broadly need to move safely forward, will the Prime Minister outline whether the plans will include the free lateral flow test for the army of unpaid carers that have kept society taking over, with indications that 1 in 7 are unpaid carers in Northern Ireland alone who need to test before they come in and provide care for their vulnerable or their elderly loved ones, and must therefore have access to free testing to continue to provide this often overlooked but very, very necessary care. Thank you.
Madam, I want to repeat for the House, I think it's incredibly important people understand that the strategy for containing Omicron is not to test everybody or large numbers of people. It is surveillance. That we will be bringing forward particular groups that we want to continue to offer free tests to, such as the clinically extremely vulnerable, but there will be more on that in the course of the next few weeks.
And the prize for patience and perseverance goes to Greg Smith.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I warmly welcome my right honourable friend's statement this afternoon. He is making the right call. Freedom works. Indeed, we should always cherish freedom. But as we have seen in the past, when previous restrictions have been lifted, some bodies, particularly those with a union hand hovering over them, have continued with those restrictions regardless. So as we rightly lift these restrictions and allow others to lapse, can my right honourable friend give a clear message that the turn to personal responsibility is not a licence for those bodies to carry on with the restrictions regardless.
I thank my honourable friend very much, but I think that the feeling, if I understand him correctly, he's referring to the devolved administrations. I think that was what he was saying. I think the instinct for liberty burns just as brightly in Scotland and Wales, Mr. Speaker, and Northern Ireland. And I think the people of the whole of the United Kingdom will understand that what we want is a sensible, balanced, and proportionate approach that moves away from legal compulsion, something that has been quite extraordinary for these times, and moves in favour of people being considerate towards others and taking personal responsibility.
Thank you. I will pause for a moment to allow people to leave in a swift and silent manner before making space for the statement from the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. With your permission, I would like to make a statement on the electricity disruptions as a result of Storm Eunice and set out exactly how we're working to ensure that power is restored to people's homes as quickly as possible. Storm Eunice, as everybody knows, brought severe weather, including wind gusts of up to 122 miles per hour, among the highest speeds ever recorded in England. The Met Office took the unprecedented step of issuing a double red weather warning for Friday. Ensuing hurricane-force winds have caused extensive damage to buildings and trees. They've also caused power outages and widespread travel delays. After a day of disruption caused by Storm Eunice on Friday, last night, Storm Franklin made landfall. And it must be remembered that in this difficult time, 4 people have tragically lost their lives in incidents related to storms. And my thoughts, and I'm sure the thoughts of the whole House, with the families and friends of those who have lost loved ones. The Met Office estimates that further strong gusts today, though not on the same scale as Storm Eunice, will occur. Some people, particularly in the south and east of England, have been without power for more than 72 hours. I want to reassure them that we have dedicated teams of engineers working night and day to get them reconnected as soon as possible. Continuing poor weather conditions have hampered those efforts, but I'm pleased to say that as of now, over 98% of those affected by storms, over 1.4 million customers, have had their power restored so far, their supply restored. However, as of only 4 o'clock today, there are still just under 30,000 households who are without power. Today, my right honourable friend, the member for Hammersmith and Fulham, has been in Sevenoaks in Kent to see the impacts of the storm and to observe repairs. This weekend, I spoke, Madam Deputy Speaker, directly with leaders at Scottish and Southern Energy Networks, and today I had conversations with leading managers at UK Power Networks and Western Power Distribution. They have given me assurances, Madam Deputy Speaker, that restoration is happening as quickly as possible. The UK has been particularly badly hit by storms this year, but I'm pleased to say that overall our network operators and our brave emergency services have learnt lessons about how we can improve our response, and we will continue to learn those lessons. When I commissioned the review into our response to Storm Arwen in November, I made clear that the very long delays some people faced to be reconnected were not acceptable. I'm pleased to say that where practical, network operators have already implemented improvements to their procedures. Additionally, operators are sharing resources and making sure that engineers are sent to the worst affected areas. Welfare provisions are in place for those who are most in need, particularly the vulnerable members of our community. Network operators are engaged with local partners to ensure that people are being supported. Catering units are travelling to badly hit areas, and smaller welfare units are providing hot water and other facilities to people adversely affected. I'm extremely grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the network operators that in the Storm Arwen situation we did have issues relating to the difficulty of communicating people's the worst effects of the devastation. And people are still experiencing issues today. But I'm very pleased to say that if they call their network operator by dialing 105 from their mobile, there should be a speedy response. This action will automatically route them to the right operator based on their particular physical location. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is the first time in recorded history, I believe, that 3 named storms have come in such quick succession, day after day, since the storm naming convention was introduced little less than a decade ago. It's a difficult time for many people, but I've been reassured that operators are working extremely hard to make sure that people are reconnected as quickly as possible and at the latest in the next couple of days. And I and my department will continue to provide that support and apply pressure where need be to ensure that this happens in a timely way. Thank you.
Ed Miliband.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for his statement, and let me first join him in sending my condolences to the families of the victims who tragically died during Storm Eunice. And I express my sympathy to all of those who have been affected by the storms. Many families have endured real hardship in these last few days without power for an extended period. And I also know, including from my own constituency, that many others are currently facing anxious times from the threat of flooding from Storm Franklin, and my thoughts are with them too. And I also want to join him in offering praise for all the engineers, network staff and the emergency services who have done such a really important job in incredibly difficult circumstances over the last few days, and also local authorities who've played a really important role in the emergency response. On the substance of his statement, let me just make a few points and ask some questions. First, as he says, the most important priority is to reconnect those still without power. I welcome what he says about people being reconnected by Wednesday at the latest, and I trust he will, as he says, hold all the companies to account to mobilise all their resources from indeed around the whole country to make sure this happens. Second, on vulnerable households, as he says in its interim review on the response to Storm Arwen last November, Bayes noted confusion of roles and responsibilities for vulnerable customers and communities that were cut off. He says the arrangements are working better, and I'm glad that lessons have been learned. Can he just tell us how he, as Secretary of State, is monitoring this and is assured of this? Third, on compensation paid by the networks. There were unacceptable delays in compensation payments after Storm Arwen, with 10,000 customers still not compensated 6 weeks after the storm happened. Can he say what he'll be doing on this occasion to ensure speedy payments? And fourth, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to ask the Secretary of State about the longer-term issues these events raise. Now, scientists tell us we can't necessarily attribute the ferocity of Storm Eunice to climate change, but we know we are facing more intense and frequent extreme weather as a result of the climate crisis. So it throws up again the question of our resilience and security as a country. After the storms in 2013, there was a clear sense of the vulnerabilities of the overhead power network and agreement the energy networks would act. In its interim report on Storm Arwen this month, again Ofgem said they would review the costs and benefits of the resilience of overhead lines, and the Climate Change Committee has highlighted climate risks to the power system. Does the Secretary of State agree that events this winter demonstrate the need to give greater priority and indeed probably investment to the resilience of our power network? And more generally on the issue of adaptation, in their 5-year progress report last summer, the Climate Change Committee said the whole issue of adaptation was, and I quote, under-resourced, underfunded and often ignored. Does he agree that these storms and the storms we've seen, does he agree the storms we have seen are yet again a wake-up call about the need for a proper national resilience plan which covers our power lines, flood defences and all of our critical infrastructure? Because the truth is, Madam Deputy Speaker, that as a country we will face significant threats from extreme weather in the years ahead. Today we should acknowledge the important work that has been done to respond to this crisis. But the lesson that has been demonstrated yet again is that we owe people the long-term planning and investment to give them all the protection we can.
I think the right honourable gentleman, as well as I think other members of the House, will be surprised that I'm in a measure of agreement with him. on this. I think he's absolutely right to warn that extreme weather events could, I'm not saying they will, but they could be a feature of our landscape, of our climate. I also remember as a constituency MP the floods of 2013-2014 and the devastation that they caused. On his specific challenges, he will appreciate the fact that I launched a review into Storm Arwen. We've got an interim report. We've learnt many of the lessons from that interim report. And we're also committed to dealing with other colleagues, conversing with other colleagues across government for a more integrated plan. I'm grateful for him to highlight the extreme weather conditions that many of us may well be facing in the future.
Hugh Merriman.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome Secretary of State's statement. Thousands of my constituents across East Sussex remain not just without electricity, but also without water. Now, I recognise this has been one of the worst storms in decades. I also recognise the huge amount of work that the engineers and those from UK Power Networks and South East Water on the ground have delivered to try and fix this. But the situation can't be good enough that our water supply actually requires the electricity system to work, and there's no backup generators in place to pump it into the hills and areas across my constituency. So can I meet with the Secretary of State to discuss how we can get better resilience in place so that the water companies have their own backup generators in place and people are not without water when the electricity goes down?
I think my honourable friend makes a very fair point, and he is absolutely right to point out the difficulties that people are facing, intolerable difficulties with regard to water supply, and that's something which colleagues in the department in DEFRA and also officials in Bays are very, very engaged with, and I'd be very happy to speak to him at a time when it's convenient.
Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Following storms Arwen and Barra in November and December, Malik and Corrie in late January, we've now had 3 named storms in a week in Dudley, Eunice and Franklin, with a potential 4th in 8 days, Gladys, later this week. This winter, it seems, Madam Deputy Speaker, will not go quietly. But naming storms sometimes can dull the impact of these storms, but the truth is, Madam Deputy Speaker, that these storms with the heavy rain and snowfall combined with record-breaking wind have caused huge damage to buildings, environmental destruction, and sadly 4 people have lost their lives as a result of uprooted trees, flying debris and flooding, and my sympathies are very much with all of those affected. Can I join the Shadow Secretary of State in thanking all those engineers restoring power to homes right across the country, and indeed the Network Rail engineers for restoring our track and keeping us moving across the country. And I'm very sympathetic to points he made about compensation payments. But climate change has seen increased frequency of storms, with Storm Franklin currently causing flood warnings in parts of Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland. So will the Secretary of State confirm that he will do all he can to ensure his government keeps its climate pledge and the large spending commitments that goes with them, and ignore those on his backbenches who seem obsessed with the UK reneging on its agreements? And what is being done while we're ahead of COP26 to discuss future international responses to worldwide extreme weather? But finally, Eunice left about 1.4 million houses without power. Storm Arwen affected more than 1 million homes, including thousands in Aberdeenshire without power for well over a week. Which short and long-term plans are being considered by the UK Government to strengthen our energy resilience and infrastructure, and crucially, what's being done to ensure we don't see a repeat of last year with thousands without power for so long?
The honourable gentleman raises a number of fair points. I mean, with respect to the net zero challenge, he'll be pleased to know in the latest CSR that was announced by my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, only at the end of last year, we had a considerable uplift in the capital spend dedicated to net zero. He will also appreciate that for the first time ever, we had a ring fence for tidal stream. So there are lots and lots of things that this government is doing to pursue renewables and to pursue a world in which we have effectively decarbonised our power system. On resilience issues, he will know that I've commissioned the review into Storm Arwen. There's an interim report, and I'm sure he and I will be able to discuss the full report in due course.
Robbie Moore.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Storm Eunice and Franklin continue to have devastating impacts across Keighley and Ilkley, with several homes still flooded and a landslide being caused to the rear of a property on Westley Avenue in Riddlesden, which has forced several constituents out of their homes, with one property left at structural risk. And my heart goes out to all of those impacted. So can my right honourable friend assure me that emergency support will be made available to all of those affected, but particularly those who face the critical situation of being forced out of their homes for their own safety?
As I suggested in the statement, my honourable friend, I think, will be pleased to know that we are working very, very closely with the distribution network operators to ensure that adequate physical support is given, and also there is a compensation scheme that's been operated with Ofgem, and I personally raised the amount that people could be compensated in the aftermath of Storm Arwen, and we are going to stick to that this time. So there is plenty of support for his constituents.
Wayne David.
Last week saw a red alert for much of South Wales. I note that the Minister has said there's been a number of discussions with electricity companies, including Western Power Distribution. But can he tell the House what discussion has been with the Welsh Government?
We speak to officials in the devolved administrations on a regular basis. I only spoke to WPD and the distribution network companies, but our officials engage with DA colleagues all the time.
Theo Clark.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Following this week's storms, yet again my Stafford constituents have been hit by flooding in their homes, and Staffordshire businesses have again been disrupted. So will my right honourable friend work with me to create a flood control centre based in Stafford, which will provide 24-hour local assistance to my constituents affected by flooding in Stafford?
So, I'd like to reassure my honourable friend that as a consequence of the 2013-2014 floods, we did establish and make much more robust local resilience fora and flood defence networks. And I'd be very happy to discuss with her schemes that may be applied to her constituency, particularly in regard to a centre in Stafford.
Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are flood warnings in place across South Yorkshire, a worrying time for many in Barnsley, especially those without adequate insurance. Now, I acknowledge the work of Flood Re, but sadly for many it is still not affordable. So what work is the government doing with insurance companies to make sure everyone can get the insurance that they deserve?
Again, I refer to the 2013-2014 period. I know a number of people weren't in the House at that time, but this is precisely the issue that came up. And we've tried to engage with Flood Re. I think they have responded more effectively, and we're going to try and see what more could be done in this area.
Mark Pritchard.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Shropshire's seen 3 storms in 1 week. Massive flooding along the River Severn and displaced flooding, huge amount of storm damage. Often in these circumstances, the actions or inactions of insurance companies supporting struggling businesses post-pandemic and now being flooded, and people that have been driven out of their homes, compounds the trauma that so many people suffer. Would the Secretary of State ensure that his department deals with the Association of